Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The door clicked shut behind me with a muted finality. A chill settled on my skin despite the warm air, a creeping sensation that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the scent of the room, a mix of dust and something sweet like forgotten flowers. My breath held steady, but each inhale felt like it brushed against something unseen. It was a quiet I couldn't place, a stillness that seemed to lean in closer. The air had shifted, and with it, my sense of what was real. The nausea comes first, always the nausea. It starts somewhere behind my ribs, a slow unfurling that spreads like ink through water. I've learned to recognize its particular texture, not the sharp stab of food poisoning or the rolling waves of motion sickness, but something more insidious. A wrongness that seems to originate from the very core of me, as if my body knows something my mind refuses to acknowledge. I find myself standing at kitchen sinks more often than I should, gripping the cold porcelain edge until my knuckles whiten. The sound of running water helps sometimes. The constant rush drowns out other sounds, the ones that might not be there at all. But even with the faucet at full blast, I can still hear the echo of that particular silence, the way sound seemed to fold in on itself in that room. The floorboards, they were wrong somehow, not creaking when they should have or creaking when they shouldn't. I remember the way my footsteps seemed to lag behind my movements, as if the house itself was struggling to keep pace with reality. But that's impossible, isn't it? Houses don't struggle, wood doesn't hesitate, yet I can still feel the slight give beneath my feet, the way the floor seemed to breathe. She was wearing blue that day, or was it green? The color shifts in my memory like oil on water, never quite settling into certainty. But I remember the fabric, something soft that caught the light filtering through those gauze curtains. The way she moved through the room was fluid, almost weightless. Her hands gestured as she spoke, fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air between us. What did we talk about? The words have dissolved, leaving only their emotional residue. There was laughter, I think, the kind that comes too easily, fills spaces that should remain empty. My own voice sounds foreign in the memory, too bright, too eager to please. I was performing something normalcy, perhaps, or interest, but underneath ran a current of unease that I couldn't name then and struggled to articulate now. The photographs on the mantelpiece watched us. That's how it felt anyway. Their glass surfaces reflected not light but attention, as if the people trapped behind those frames were pressing forward, trying to break through into our conversation. I found myself avoiding their gaze, focusing instead on her hands, her mouth, the way shadows moved across the wall behind her. There was a moment when she stopped talking, just stopped mid-sentence, as if someone had pressed pause on her thoughts. Her eyes went somewhere else, somewhere beyond the room, beyond me. The silence stretched between us like a held breath. I should have asked if she was all right, should have reached out, touched her arm, brought her back from wherever she'd gone. Instead, I waited and watched as something shifted in her expression, something that made my stomach clench with recognition I couldn't explain. The sweet smell grows stronger in my memory now. Not flowers, after all, too cloying for flowers. More like fruit left too long in the sun, that moment just before decay sets in when sweetness becomes almost unbearable. It clung to everything in that room, settled into the fabric of the curtains, the upholstery, my clothes. Even now, certain scents trigger that same visceral response, that same need to step away, to breathe clean air. I've tried to map the sequence of events, to lay them out in neat chronological order, but memory doesn't work that way. It folds and doubles back on itself, creates impossible geometries where cause and effect lose their meaning. Was it before or after the silence that I noticed the way light fell across the carpet? The pattern it made looked almost deliberate, like someone had arranged the shadows to spell out words I couldn't read. Her laugh returns to me now, bubbling up from some deep well of recollection, but it's changed somehow, distorted by distance and doubt. What had seemed genuine in the moment now carries undertones of something else. Hysteria, maybe, or performance. As if she were reading from a script I hadn't been given, playing a role in a drama I didn't understand I was part of. The wrongness spreads through my body again, that familiar tide of unease. My hands shake as I write this, not from fear exactly, but from a kind of exhaustion that sleep never quite touches. There are nights when I lie awake reconstructing every detail I can remember, searching for the moment when everything shifted. But it's like trying to pinpoint the exact instant when day becomes night. The change is both gradual and absolute, impossible to pin down. The room had too many corners, that's what I keep coming back to. Not architecturally, I'm not losing my grip on basic geometry. But perceptually, there seemed to be spaces that shouldn't have existed, angles that folded away from direct observation. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, certain someone was standing just outside my peripheral vision. But when I turned, there was only wall, only shadow, only the persistent sense that the room contained more than it should. She offered me tea, Earl Grey, she said, though the liquid in my cup was darker than it should have been, bitter despite the sugar I watched her add. I drank it anyway, politeness overriding instinct. The taste lingers even now, metallic and wrong. My tongue felt thick afterward, words becoming clumsy in my mouth. Perhaps that's why I remember so little of our actual conversation, the tea stealing my ability to form coherent thoughts. But no, that's not right either. The confusion came before the tea, didn't it? Or maybe there was no tea at all. Maybe that's just another layer of false memory, my mind's attempt to provide rational explanation for irrational experience. The more I examine these recollections, the more they seem to shift and blur, like looking at something underwater. The photographs, I keep coming back to the photographs. There was one in particular, a group shot, people arranged in careful poses that spoke of special occasion. But their faces were wrong somehow, not distorted or damaged, just wrong. As if someone had taken a perfectly normal family portrait and made subtle adjustments, changes so small they registered only as unease rather than conscious recognition. She noticed me looking, her eyes followed mine to the mantelpiece, and for a moment something passed between us, understanding, perhaps, or shared recognition of the strangeness. But then she smiled, that same bright performance smile, and made some comment about family that I've since forgotten. The moment dissolved, leaving me to wonder if it had happened at all. The floorboards creaked then, I'm certain of that. The sound came from somewhere behind me, from the direction of the hallway, heavy footsteps, deliberate and slow. But when I turned, when we both turned, there was nothing there. Just the empty doorway and the suggestion of movement in the shadows beyond. She didn't seem surprised. That's what troubles me most in retrospect. No startled reaction, no explanation or apology for the disturbance. Just a slight tightening around her eyes, a momentary pause before she continued whatever she'd been saying, as if phantom footsteps were simply part of the house's normal repertoire, no more remarkable than settling walls or shifting pipes. My hands are cramping now, fingers stiff from gripping this pen too tightly. The nausea has returned with renewed intensity, that familiar wrongness spreading through my chest and throat. I should stop writing, should step away from these memories that refuse to coalesce into coherent narrative. But something compels me forward, some need to excavate meaning from the fragments. The light changed while I was there, not gradually as clouds might pass across the sun, but abruptly as if someone had adjusted a dimmer switch. The room grew darker, shadows deepening in the corners, the sweet smell becoming more pronounced. She didn't seem to notice, continued speaking in that bright, artificial tone. But I felt the change like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders, making each breath an effort. There was something in her hair, a leaf, maybe, or a small twig. It caught my attention because it seemed so out of place. She was clearly someone who paid attention to such details, someone for whom a stray bit of nature would be immediately noticeable. But there it was, nestled just behind her left ear, dark against the lighter strands. I almost mentioned it, almost reached out to brush it away. But something stopped me, some instinct that whispered this was not a kindness she would welcome. The conversation turned to travel, or maybe it was always about travel, and I'm only now remembering that thread. She spoke of places she'd been, places she wanted to go, her voice taking on a dreamy quality that seemed more genuine than her earlier brightness. But the destinations she described didn't quite make sense, geographical impossibilities, combinations of landscape and climate that couldn't coexist in any real location. I found myself nodding along anyway, caught up in her enthusiasm despite my growing confusion. There was something hypnotic about the way she spoke, the rhythm of her words creating a kind of trance state. I felt myself sinking deeper into the chair, my body growing heavy, my thoughts becoming sluggish and unfocused. The photographs were watching again. I could feel their attention like heat on my skin, their glass surfaces reflecting not our images but something else entirely. When I tried to look directly, tried to see what they contained, my vision seemed to slip and slide, unable to find purchase on their surfaces. It was like trying to focus on something in a dream. The harder I concentrated, the more elusive it became. She stood then, moving toward the window with that same fluid grace. The light caught her differently from this angle, revealing textures in her skin that hadn't been visible before. Not wrinkles exactly, but patterns, as if she were made of some material that had been folded and refolded countless times. Her reflection in the glass was wrong too, not quite aligned with her actual position, lagging slightly behind her movements. The sweet smell was overwhelming now, so thick I could taste it coating the back of my throat. I wanted to leave, needed to leave, but my body wouldn't respond to my intentions. I sat trapped in that chair, watching her silhouette against the window, feeling the room contract around me like a closing fist. That's when I saw it, the thing that shouldn't have been there, couldn't have been there. Just a glimpse, a suggestion of movement in the reflection behind her. Something that made my blood freeze and my vision blur. Something that transformed the entire nature of my visit from social call to something else entirely. But what was it? The memory fractures here, splits into incompatible versions of events. In one, she turns toward me with eyes that aren't quite the right color. In another, the room fills with a sound like distant screaming. In a third, I'm running toward the door, my feet barely touching those breathing floorboards. The truth is probably simpler than any of these dramatic reconstructions. Probably nothing more than an overactive imagination, stress, too much caffeine, too little sleep. The mind creates patterns where none exist, finds threat in shadow and suggestion. That's what I tell myself during the rational hours, when sunlight makes everything ordinary again. But the nausea doesn't lie. The body keeps its own record, maintains its own truth independent of rational explanation. And my body remembers wrongness, remembers the way that room felt like a trap closing slowly around me, remembers the weight of those watching photographs and the sweet smell of something rotting beneath perfume. I don't remember leaving. That's the most disturbing part, the complete absence of departure from my recollection. One moment I'm sitting in that chair, paralyzed by whatever I saw or thought I saw in the window's reflection. The next, I'm standing on a sidewalk somewhere, blinking in natural light, my clothes carrying that cloying sweetness like a signature I couldn't wash out. The walk home is a blur of familiar streets that felt foreign, normal sights that carried undertones of menace. Every shadow seemed deeper than it should be. Every stranger's glance lingered too long. The wrongness had followed me out of that room, settled into my bones like an infection I couldn't shake. Even now, writing this, I can feel it stirring again. That same visceral unease, that same need to look over my shoulder, to check the corners of my own room for signs of impossible geometry. The photographs on my own mantelpiece seem different somehow, their subjects' eyes tracking my movements with newfound awareness. The sweet smell returns sometimes, usually in the moments between waking and sleep when the barriers between memory and reality grow thin. I'll catch a whiff of that particular wrongness and feel my stomach clench in recognition, feel my hands begin to shake with remembered fear. But fear of what exactly? That's the question that haunts me, the uncertainty that makes sleep elusive and waking hours feel like performance. Without a clear threat to name, without a definite event to process, I'm left floating in a sea of maybe and might have been, my mind creating increasingly elaborate explanations for sensations I can't quite trust. The rational part of me knows this is how paranoia begins with doubt, with the erosion of certainty about one's own perceptions. It starts small, a feeling that something isn't quite right, then grows and spreads until every interaction carries undertones of potential threat, until every memory becomes suspect, until the boundary between internal and external reality begins to blur. But knowing this doesn't make the feelings less real, doesn't explain why certain combinations of light and shadow make my breath catch, why the sound of footsteps in empty hallways sends ice through my veins, why I find myself avoiding rooms that smell too sweet, houses with too many photographs, conversations that feel like performances. She's still out there somewhere in that room with its breathing floors and watching pictures, still offering tea that tastes wrong, still laughing that bright artificial laugh, still carrying whatever wrongness clings to her like perfume. The thought should comfort me if she's there, then she's not here, not following me through my days and nights like a persistent shadow. But comfort doesn't come. Instead, there's only the growing certainty that what happened in that room wasn't finished, that whatever I witnessed or participated in was only the beginning of something larger and more terrible than my fractured memories can contain. The nausea rises again, that familiar wrongness spreading through my chest like spilled ink. My hands shake as I set down this pen, as I try to convince myself that writing about it has helped, that excavating these memories has somehow robbed them of their power. But the sweet smell lingers in the air around me, impossible and undeniable. And somewhere in the distance, so faint it might be imagination, I can hear the sound of floorboards creaking under invisible weight, the whisper of gauze curtains moving in still air, the soft click of a door closing with muted finality. Story 2. Every morning the shoes by the door faced east, neatly aligned like silent sentinels marking the start of the day. It was a small detail, one I barely noticed until I did. Last Monday, one shoe veered slightly off course, heel turned in. Tuesday brought another subtle shift, the left shoe now pointing north. Patterns warped in their prescribed orbit. Today's arrangement felt deliberate, expectant. It's just shoes, I told myself. But why does the house seem quieter when I look at them? The logical explanation came to me while I stood there, coffee growing cold in my hands. My roommate had been working late shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted, feet dragging. When you're that tired, precision becomes impossible. The careful ritual of aligning, shoes something we'd both maintained for months, would naturally deteriorate under stress. Simple fatigue, nothing more. I could trace the timeline clearly. The position changes coincided perfectly with the new rotation schedule that started 3 weeks ago. 12-hour shifts, sometimes back-to-back doubles. I'd hear the key in the lock at impossible hours, the soft thud of shoes being kicked off rather than placed. The misalignment was just evidence of exhaustion, a small crack in our shared domestic order. But my hands trembled as I reached for those shoes, and I couldn't understand why. The scent hit me first, not the familiar leather and rubber I expected, but something metallic and sharp. I pulled my fingers back, studying the space where the shoes sat. The hardwood floor showed no scuff marks, no signs of the careless removal I'd imagined. If anything, the placement looked too deliberate, as if someone had spent time considering each angle. My roommate's schedule was posted on the refrigerator, written in careful blue ink. I checked it twice, then 3 times. The handwriting looked different somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint how. The letters seemed more angular, pressed deeper into the paper. When I touched the surface, my fingertip came away with a faint blue smudge, as if the ink were still wet. The first memory fragment came while I was washing dishes. Suddenly I was standing in the doorway again, but the light was wrong, too dim for morning, too orange. In this flash of recollection, I wasn't alone. Someone stood behind me, close enough that I could feel their breath on my neck, but when I turned around in the memory, there was nothing, just the sensation of presence and the sound of breathing that might have been my own. I shook my head, focusing on the warm, soapy water, the solid weight of the ceramic mug in my hands. Stress could play tricks on memory. I'd been working too much myself, sleeping poorly. The mind fills gaps with imagination when reality becomes too mundane or overwhelming. Yet as I dried my hands, I noticed something else. The towel was damp, but I was the only one home. I'd been the only one home since yesterday evening, according to my clear recollection of events. My roommate's bed was made with hospital corners, untouched. The bathroom showed no signs of recent use. So who had used this towel? The second wave of contradictory memories struck while I sat at my desk, trying to focus on work. This time I saw myself coming home late, fumbling with keys that felt foreign in my hands. But that was impossible. I'd been home all evening, hadn't left except for a brief walk around the block before dinner. In this other memory, though, I was wearing different clothes. A jacket I didn't recognize, shoes that squeaked against the floor. I watched myself or someone who looked like me carefully arranging footwear by the door, adjusting angles with mathematical precision. The figure in my memory moved with purpose, but their face remained hidden, turned away. The phone rang, jarring me back to the present. My supervisor's voice sounded distant, asking about deadlines I couldn't remember. I heard myself giving appropriate responses, but my attention remained fixed on the shoes, visible from where I sat. Had they moved again? The left one seemed to have shifted another degree clockwise. After the call ended, I found myself walking through the house, cataloging details I'd never noticed before. A coffee cup in the sink that I didn't remember using. A book on the nightstand, open to a page I'd never read. The thermostat set 3 degrees cooler than my usual preference. Each discovery felt like evidence, but evidence of what? The rational explanations multiplied. Memory gaps were common during periods of stress. I could have made that coffee and forgotten about it immediately. The book might have fallen open randomly. Thermostats had minds of their own, but the accumulation of small mysteries created a weight in my chest, a pressure that made breathing feel deliberate rather than automatic. That evening I decided to stay awake and watch. I positioned myself in the living room with a clear view of the entryway, determined to solve the riddle of the moving shoes. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs. Outside, the streetlight cast long shadows through the windows, creating patterns that shifted with the movement of branches. Around midnight, I must have dozed off despite my intentions. I woke to the sound of a door closing, not the front door, but something deeper in the house. My neck ached from sleeping in the chair, and the room felt colder. When I looked toward the entryway, both shoes were gone. My heart hammered as I searched the house, turning on every light. The shoes weren't in any of the bedrooms, not in the bathroom or kitchen. I even checked the basement, though we rarely went down there. Nothing. It was as if they'd simply vanished. But when I returned to the living room, they were back in their place by the door, both pointing east again, perfectly aligned. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at those shoes and trying to construct a logical framework for what I'd experienced. Sleepwalking, perhaps. I could have moved them myself during that period of unconsciousness, though I'd never been a sleepwalker before. The mind could play elaborate tricks when pushed to its limits. Yet another memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. In this one, I was standing exactly where I stood now, but the house was different. Darker, colder. The walls seemed to lean inward, and the shoes by the door weren't shoes at all, but something else entirely objects I couldn't quite identify, arranged in a pattern that hurt to look at directly. In this memory that wasn't a memory, I understood that I'd been playing a game without knowing the rules. Each morning, I'd been leaving a message through the arrangement of those shoes, and each evening, someone or something had been responding. A conversation conducted in angles and directions, in the language of displaced objects. The next morning brought a new configuration. Both shoes faced west now, toward the back of the house, toward the basement door. I called in sick to work, unable to concentrate on anything beyond the growing certainty that my original explanation was wrong. This wasn't about tired roommates or failing memory. Something else was happening, something that existed in the spaces between logical thought. Throughout the day, I found myself drawn repeatedly to that basement door. I'd lived in this house for over a year, but realized I'd only been down there a handful of times. The basement was unfinished, mostly used for storage. Boxes of old belongings, a water heater, the usual detritus of domestic life, nothing remarkable. But as I stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the shadows, I smelled that metallic scent again. Stronger now, mixed with something organic and unfamiliar. My hand hesitated on the light switch. Part of me didn't want to see what might be waiting below. The bulb flickered when I finally flipped the switch, casting unsteady light over the concrete floor and exposed beams. Everything looked normal, exactly as I remembered it, yet the smell persisted, and with it came a new sensation, the feeling of being watched from multiple directions at once. I descended slowly, each step echoing in the confined space. Halfway down, I noticed footprints in the dust. Not just mine, but others. Smaller prints, barefoot, leading from the stairs to the far corner where the shadows were deepest. The prints were fresh, the dust around them undisturbed except for the clear impression of toes and heels. Following the trail, I discovered something impossible. In the corner, arranged in a perfect circle, were dozens of shoes. Not just the pairs from upstairs, but shoes I'd never seen before. Children's sneakers, work boots, elegant heels, all pointing inward toward a space in the center where the concrete was stained dark. The final memory crashed over me like cold water. I was down here before, many times before, but not as myself. I was smaller, younger, watching from the stairs as figures moved in the darkness below. The shoes belonged to visitors who came at night, people who entered through doors that existed only in certain kinds of light. They gathered in circles, speaking in whispers that sounded like wind through dry leaves. But that was impossible. I'd never been a child in this house. I'd moved here as an adult, signed the lease myself, chosen this place for its quiet neighborhood and reasonable rent. The memory felt real, but it contradicted everything I knew about my own life. Standing in that basement, surrounded by shoes that shouldn't exist, I realized I could no longer distinguish between what I knew and what I remembered, between what I'd experienced and what I'd imagined. The two versions of reality had become so intertwined that separating them felt like trying to unweave fabric while wearing it. I climbed back upstairs, leaving the light on below. The shoes by the front door were gone again, and this time I didn't bother looking for them. Instead, I sat in the living room and waited, watching the shadows lengthen as evening approached. The house grew quiet around me, but it was a different kind of quiet now, not empty but expectant, as if the building itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to begin. When the sun finally set, I heard the first footsteps on the stairs leading up from the basement. Soft, barefoot steps that matched the prints I'd seen in the dust. Then another set and another, until the sound became a gentle procession moving through the house. I didn't turn around to look. Some knowledge I'd learned was too heavy to carry in the daylight. Instead, I focused on my breathing, on the feeling of the chair beneath me, on the last traces of rational thought that insisted this was all elaborate self-deception. But as the footsteps circled around me, and I felt the familiar sensation of being watched from multiple directions, I wondered if the real deception had been believing I ever understood what was happening in this house at all. The morning will come again, and with it, new arrangements of objects I can't explain. I'll construct fresh theories, build new frameworks of logic to contain the inexplicable. But now I know that somewhere beneath the surface of every rational explanation, another truth is waiting, patient, persistent, and utterly beyond my comprehension. The shoes by the door will tell their story in angles and directions, and I'll listen with the part of me that remembers standing on basement stairs, watching visitors who cast no shadows. Whether that part of me is memory or madness, I may never know. But in this house where patterns shift and objects migrate, perhaps the distinction no longer matters. Story 3. It was the rhythmic drip, methodical yet intrusive, echoing against the silence of the room. Each drop punctuated the stillness, reaching me from somewhere just beyond the threshold of my understanding. I found myself rooted in place, the softness of the rug pressing insistently into my feet despite my will to move. The sound seemed to draw from an old well of memory, its source concealed in the yet-to-be-remembered. I stepped cautiously, the familiarity unnerving, as if I had walked this same path in another time, another place. The kitchen was empty, yet the drips grew sharper, more insistent. I realized with growing apprehension that I couldn't ignore it. The sound had followed me from my past, and now it was here, demanding acknowledgement. I knew what had happened that night. The certainty of it had anchored me through months of sleepless hours and careful reconstruction. My sister had been drinking again heavily, the way she always did when the pressure mounted. She'd been standing at the kitchen sink, washing dishes with that particular aggressive precision she reserved for her worst moods. The faucet had been acting up for weeks, that steady drip that she kept meaning to fix but never got around to addressing. The glass had slipped from her soapy hands. I could picture it so clearly, the way it caught the overhead light as it fell, the sharp crack as it met the porcelain basin, the inevitable result as she reached down to collect the pieces. The cut had been deep, running along the inside of her wrist where the skin was thinnest. She'd called out for help, but by the time I reached the kitchen, she was already on the floor, the blood mixing with the soapy water in patterns that reminded me of abstract art. The paramedics said it was an accident. The police report listed it as such. Even the insurance company accepted the claim without question. Everything pointed to a tragic mishap, the kind that happens when someone who's had too much to drink handles sharp objects carelessly. The evidence supported this conclusion completely. But that dripping sound, it had started again, just like it did that night. Only now I was in a different house, a different kitchen, and my sister had been gone for 6 months. I pressed my palm against the counter, feeling the cool granite beneath my fingertips. The sound was coming from somewhere behind me, near the breakfast nook where morning light usually streamed through gauze curtains. I turned slowly, my bare feet silent against the tile floor. The window above the small table was closed, no obvious source for water, yet the dripping continued, patient and persistent. That's when the first crack appeared in my carefully constructed certainty. I remembered something I'd forgotten, or perhaps something I'd chosen not to remember. The night my sister died, she'd called me 3 times before I finally answered. The first 2 calls had gone to voicemail, and I'd been too absorbed in my own evening routine to notice the phone lighting up on the coffee table. When I finally picked up on the 3rd attempt, her voice had sounded different. Not drunk, as I'd later told everyone. Different. "I need to tell you something," she'd said, and there had been an urgency in her tone that I'd attributed to alcohol, but now seemed like something else entirely. "Can it wait until tomorrow?" I'd asked, already thinking about the early meeting I had scheduled, the presentation I still needed to review. "I don't think it can," she'd replied, and then there had been silence. Not the silence of someone gathering their thoughts, but the silence of someone listening, as if she'd heard something that required her immediate attention. "Are you there?" I'd asked. "Someone's here," she'd whispered, so quietly I almost missed it. But I had dismissed it. My sister was prone to paranoia when she drank, always imagining sounds that weren't there, movements in her peripheral vision that turned out to be shadows cast by passing headlights. I'd told her to lock her doors and get some sleep, and I'd hung up feeling virtuous about not enabling her late-night anxiety spirals. The dripping grew louder, more insistent. I found myself walking toward it, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name. The breakfast nook was empty, the table clear except for a single water ring where someone had placed a glass without using a coaster. The ring was fresh, the wood still dark with moisture. I lived alone. I hadn't had visitors in weeks. My hands began to shake as I examined the watermark more closely. It was perfectly round, the kind left by a drinking glass rather than a mug or bottle. I pressed my finger to the center of the ring, and the wood was not just damp but cold, as if the glass had contained something chilled. The dripping stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, shallow and quick. I realized I was holding my breath, straining to listen for something I couldn't identify. The kitchen felt different now, charged with a tension that hadn't been there moments before. The familiar space seemed to shift around me, shadows falling in patterns I didn't recognize despite having lived here for 2 years. I thought about my sister's apartment, how it had looked when I'd gone to collect her belongings. The police had released the scene quickly. There was no reason to hold it longer than necessary for an accidental death. But walking through those rooms, I'd noticed things that seemed inconsistent with the official story. The kitchen had been too clean, not clean the way my sister usually kept it, with dishes stacked haphazardly and counters wiped down with whatever was handy, but clean in a deliberate, methodical way. Every surface had been scrubbed, the sink polished to a shine that reflected the overhead lights like a mirror. Even the floor had been mopped, something my sister rarely did unless she was expecting company. The broken glass had been swept up completely. Not a single shard remained, not even the tiny fragments that always seemed to escape initial cleanup efforts. I'd found that odd, given that she'd supposedly been bleeding and in distress. How had she managed such a thorough job while waiting for help to arrive? The dripping resumed, but now it seemed to be coming from a different direction. I turned toward the sound and found myself facing the kitchen sink. The faucet was off, the handles positioned exactly as I'd left them that morning, but water was falling from somewhere, each drop creating concentric circles in a glass that hadn't been there before. The glass was half full, the water clear and still. I approached it cautiously, my reflection wavering in the liquid's surface. As I got closer, I could see that the water wasn't coming from the faucet at all. It was condensation, forming on the outside of the glass and rolling down to collect on the counter below. But condensation required a temperature differential. The glass would need to contain something cold, something that had been chilled well below room temperature. I reached out to touch the rim, and my fingers met ice-cold glass that sent a shock through my nervous system. I jerked my hand back and stepped away from the sink. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Perhaps I'd poured myself a glass of water earlier and forgotten about it. Perhaps the ice maker in the refrigerator had been more generous than usual, creating a drink cold enough to produce this effect hours later. But I knew I hadn't poured any water. I knew I hadn't opened the refrigerator since morning, and I knew that the glass hadn't been there when I'd entered the kitchen. The certainty I'd carried for 6 months began to crumble like old mortar. I thought about the night my sister died, how I'd arrived at her apartment to find the door unlocked. She never left her door unlocked, not even when she was expecting someone. I'd called out as I entered, but there had been no response, just the sound of water running in the kitchen. I'd found her on the floor beside the sink, her wrist bandaged with a dish towel that was soaked through with blood. She'd still been conscious, barely, her eyes tracking my movement as I knelt beside her. I'd called for an ambulance immediately, then tried to apply pressure to the wound while we waited. But now I remembered something else, something I'd pushed aside in the chaos of that night. As I'd held the towel against her wrist, she'd tried to speak. Her voice had been weak, barely audible above the sound of the running water, but she'd been trying to tell me something important. "Not accident," she'd whispered, her eyes wide and urgent. Someone was here. I'd assumed she was delirious from blood loss, confused and disoriented. The paramedics had arrived within minutes, and in the flurry of activity that followed, her words had been forgotten. Later, when the police asked me about her final statements, I'd told them she'd been unconscious when I found her. It had seemed kinder somehow, less complicated. The glass in my sink was empty now, the water having evaporated or drained away while I wasn't looking. But the condensation rings remained on the counter, perfect circles that seemed to multiply as I watched. One became 2, then 3, as if invisible glasses were being placed and removed by hands I couldn't see. I backed away from the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs. The logical explanations I'd been constructing fell apart under the weight of accumulating impossibilities. Someone had been in my house. Someone was still here, moving through my space with a familiarity that suggested they'd done this before. The dripping followed me as I retreated to the living room, the sound seeming to emanate from the walls themselves. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, thinking I should call someone, but who would believe what I was experiencing? And more importantly, what exactly would I tell them? That I was hearing sounds that had no source, that glasses were appearing and disappearing in my kitchen, that I was beginning to suspect my sister's death hadn't been the accident everyone believed it to be. My finger hovered over the emergency call button, but I couldn't bring myself to press it. Instead, I found myself scrolling through my contact list, looking for my sister's number. It was still there, of course, saved under the pet name I'd used since childhood. I'd been meaning to delete it, but something had always stopped me. Without thinking, I pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I was about to hang up when someone answered. "You finally figured it out," said a voice I recognized, though it wasn't my sister's. The voice belonged to her neighbor, the man who lived in the apartment across the hall. He'd been the one to suggest I check on her when she hadn't answered her door for 2 days. He'd been helpful during the aftermath, offering to water her plants and collect her mail until I could arrange for the lease to be terminated. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me was beginning to. "She knew," he continued, his voice calm and conversational. "She'd figured out what I'd been doing, how I'd been getting into her apartment when she wasn't home. She was going to report me, maybe even press charges. I couldn't let that happen." The dripping sound intensified, and I realized it was coming from my phone. Each word he spoke was punctuated by that familiar rhythm, as if he were calling from my sister's kitchen on the night she died. "The glass breaking was real," he said, "but it wasn't an accident. I broke it deliberately, used a piece to make the cut look like something that could have happened naturally. She fought, of course, but she'd been drinking, and I'm stronger than I look." I wanted to hang up, to end this conversation and pretend it wasn't happening, but I couldn't move, couldn't even lower the phone from my ear. "The beautiful thing about accidents," he continued, "is that nobody looks too closely at them. Nobody questions the obvious explanation, especially when the victim has a history of drinking problems and clumsiness." "Why are you telling me this?" I managed to ask. "Because you're starting to remember things differently. Because you're asking questions that might lead to uncomfortable answers. And because I think you deserve to know the truth before you join her." The line went dead, but the dripping continued. I realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from the phone or the kitchen or anywhere else in my house. It was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, knowing what I would find, but hoping I was wrong. The man from my sister's building was standing in my living room, water dripping from his clothes onto my hardwood floor. He must have been here for hours, waiting patiently for me to piece together the truth. "You left your back door unlocked," he said, as if that explained everything, just like she did. I thought about running, but my legs felt heavy and unresponsive. I thought about screaming, but who would hear me? My nearest neighbor was a 1/4 mile away, and the sound wouldn't carry through the trees that surrounded my property. "She called you 3 times that night," he said, moving closer. "I was already inside when she made the first call. I let her make the second one too, thinking you might answer and she'd ask you to come over, but you didn't pick up, so I had to improvise." The water at his feet was spreading, creating a dark stain that seemed to pulse with each drip. I could smell something metallic in the air, something that reminded me of the night I'd found my sister bleeding in her kitchen. "The 3rd call was my idea," he continued. "I wanted you to hear her voice one last time, to have that memory of dismissing her fears. I thought it would make the guilt more interesting." He was close enough now that I could see the details of his face, the calm expression that suggested he was discussing something as mundane as the weather. There was no anger in his features, no obvious signs of mental illness or instability. He looked like someone you might chat with in a grocery store checkout line or nod to while walking your dog. "Why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Because I could, he said simply. Because she was there and she was vulnerable and nobody would miss her enough to ask the right questions. Because accidents happen all the time and people accept them without thinking too hard about the details. The dripping had become a steady stream now, pooling around his feet and spreading across my floor. I realized that some of the water was red, tinged with something that caught the lamplight and threw it back in scattered fragments. And now you're here, he said, in this isolated house with your unlocked doors and your growing suspicions. Another accident waiting to happen. I tried to speak, to ask him how long he'd been planning this, but no sound emerged from my throat. The room seemed to be tilting around me, reality shifting in ways that made it hard to focus on any single detail. The police will find you in a few days, he continued conversationally. Maybe a week, depending on whether anyone notices you've stopped answering your phone. They'll see the signs of a break-in, evidence that someone forced their way inside while you were sleeping. A robbery gone wrong, probably, or a random act of violence by someone passing through the area. He reached into his jacket and withdrew something that glinted in the lamplight. Not a knife, but a piece of broken glass, jagged and sharp enough to do significant damage. I kept this from your sister's kitchen, he said, holding it up so I could see it clearly. I thought it might come in handy someday. The dripping stopped abruptly, and in the sudden silence I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and irregular. The man smiled, an expression that seemed genuinely warm and friendly, the kind of smile that would put strangers at ease. The thing about accidents, he said, stepping closer, is that they're so much more believable when they happen to people who are already stressed, already grieving, already isolated from their support systems. People like you. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The room continued to tilt and shift around me, and I realized that something was wrong with my perception, that the water on the floor might not be water at all. Don't worry, he said gently. It won't take long, and when it's over, you'll finally understand what your sister was trying to tell you that night. The piece of glass caught the light again as he raised it, and I found myself thinking about all the questions I should have asked, all the details I should have examined more closely. The too clean kitchen, the unlocked door, the precision of the wound that had killed her. But it was too late for questions now. The dripping had started again, and this time I knew exactly where it was coming from. Story 4. Faucet dripped slowly, but each droplet landed before the one preceding it. The toothbrush, always poised on the edge, now lay awkwardly on the floor, its bristles damp and bent as if it had rolled there intentionally. The walls absorbed sound, leaving only a muffled hum from a source I couldn't place. My footsteps echoed once, then twice, but the third step never followed. I turned, expecting a reflection in the mirror. It showed nothing but an empty room. I moved away, but somehow I was still there. The bathroom had become foreign territory overnight. I bent down to retrieve the toothbrush, noting how the bristles felt wrong against my palm, too soft, too yielding. The brand was unfamiliar, though I could have sworn I'd been using the same type for months. The packaging in the medicine cabinet confirmed my memory, yet here was this stranger of an object claiming residence on my floor. I straightened and faced the mirror again. This time my reflection appeared, but the eyes looking back seemed to belong to someone who had witnessed something I couldn't recall. Dark circles framed them like bruises that had forgotten their origin. My hand moved to touch my face, and the reflection followed, but the gesture felt rehearsed, as if I'd performed this same verification ritual before. The house beyond the bathroom door stretched out in familiar dimensions, yet each room held subtle alterations that made me question my own memory. The kitchen chair had always been positioned at that angle to the table. The photograph on the mantel displayed faces I recognized, but their expressions seemed different, more guarded than I remembered. One person in particular, standing slightly behind the others, wore a smile that didn't reach their eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that this same photo had once shown them laughing genuinely. The telephone rang, cutting through the oppressive quiet. The voice on the other end belonged to someone from the investigation team. They wanted to schedule another interview, their tone professional but tinged with something I couldn't identify. Suspicion, perhaps, or pity. "We need to go over the timeline again," they said. "There are some inconsistencies we'd like to clarify." Inconsistencies, the word hung in the air after I replaced the receiver. I walked to the window and gazed out at the street where everything appeared normal: neighbors walking their dogs, children playing in yards, cars passing at reasonable speeds. Yet I felt like an observer watching a performance designed specifically for my benefit. The manila folder sat on my desk where I'd left it the previous evening. Inside, photocopied police reports detailed an incident I was supposedly involved in, though reading about it felt like learning someone else's story. According to the documents, I had been the last person to see them before they disappeared. The victim, though no body had been found, so perhaps missing person was more accurate, had been in my home on the evening in question. I read my own statement, transcribed in neat typescript. My words described a pleasant dinner, casual conversation, and a departure around 9 in the evening. Everything normal, everything explainable. Yet as I read, I couldn't summon the actual memory of that night. It existed only in these official documents, as if the experience had bypassed my consciousness entirely and gone straight to the record. The investigators had asked about the missing person's state of mind, whether they had seemed distressed or mentioned any concerns. According to my statement, they had appeared perfectly content, even cheerful. But sitting in my chair, staring at those typed words, I began to doubt whether I had actually observed their demeanor that carefully, or if I had simply told the investigators what seemed most logical. A smell drifted through the house, something floral but cloying, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I followed it from room to room, but the scent seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. In the living room, I noticed the cushions on the sofa had been rearranged. Not dramatically, just shifted slightly, as if someone had sat there and then tried to restore the original positioning, but gotten it slightly wrong. The missing person had sat on that sofa during their visit. I remembered that much, though the memory felt borrowed rather than lived. They had complimented the room's decoration, admired a particular lamp that cast interesting shadows. Or had they? The more I concentrated, the more the memory seemed to dissolve, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I opened the closet to retrieve a jacket and found an unfamiliar scarf hanging among my clothes. Silk, expensive looking, in a color that complemented nothing else in my wardrobe. When I lifted it, the floral scent intensified. The fabric felt foreign against my fingers, yet somehow my hands seemed to know its texture. The phone rang again, this time a different voice, someone claiming to be a friend of the missing person. They wanted to know if I had any theories about what might have happened, whether I had noticed anything unusual during that final visit. Their questions felt loaded, as if they suspected I was withholding information. They seemed perfectly fine when they left, I heard myself saying, repeating the official line from my statement. But even as I spoke, I wondered if this was true, or simply what I needed it to be true. After hanging up, I sat in the kitchen and tried to reconstruct that evening methodically. We had eaten dinner. What kind of meal? The dishes had been washed and put away, leaving no evidence. We had talked about what subjects. The conversation had apparently been pleasant enough to last several hours, yet I couldn't recall a single specific topic we discussed. The harder I concentrated, the more elusive the memories became. It was like trying to remember a dream. Upon waking, the harder you grasped for details, the faster they slipped away. Perhaps this was normal. Perhaps most people couldn't recall casual conversations with perfect clarity after the fact. But the investigators seemed to expect more precision from me, as if my relationship with the missing person should have made every moment more significant, more memorable. What had our relationship been exactly? The question troubled me more than I wanted to admit. We had known each other for some time. That much was clear from the photographs and the familiarity evident in our interactions with mutual acquaintances. But the nature of our connection felt ambiguous, undefined. Friend, something more, someone I was trying to distance myself from. I found myself studying the photographs more carefully, looking for clues in body language and positioning. In some images, we stood close together, comfortable in each other's presence. In others, there seemed to be a deliberate space between us, a formality that suggested tension or unresolved issues. The missing person's expression varied too, sometimes warm and genuine, other times guarded, almost wary. One photograph in particular drew my attention. It showed us at some kind of gathering, both smiling at the camera, but something about their posture suggested they were leaning away from me slightly, as if maintaining distance while appearing friendly. Their hand rested on my arm, but the grip looked tense rather than affectionate. The doorbell chimed, startling me from my analysis. Through the peephole, I saw an investigator standing on the porch, holding a clipboard and looking patient but determined. I opened the door, trying to project the same cooperative attitude I'd maintained throughout their inquiry. "Just a few follow-up questions," they said, settling into the same chair they'd occupied during previous visits. They had developed a routine. I noticed removing their jacket in a specific way, placing their pen at a particular angle on their notepad, checking their watch before beginning. These small rituals suggested they'd conducted many such interviews, that I was just one case among many. "We've been talking to other people who knew them," the investigator said. "Some interesting details have come to light." They paused, watching my face for a reaction. I tried to maintain neutral interest, though my heart rate had accelerated noticeably. Several people mentioned that they seemed troubled recently, anxious about something. One person said they had expressed concerns about someone in their life, someone they felt might be becoming too attached or possessive. The words hung between us like an accusation wrapped in professional courtesy. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this new information objectively. "They never mentioned feeling troubled when they were here," I said, "but perhaps they were putting on a brave face." "Perhaps," the investigator agreed, making a note, "or perhaps they felt they couldn't be entirely honest about their concerns." After they left, I walked through the house again, seeing it through different eyes. Had I been possessive? The question felt both relevant and impossible to answer objectively. How does one measure their own behavior for signs of obsession or inappropriate attachment? The very act of self-examination seemed to prove the accusation a person secure in their normalcy wouldn't need to question it so intensely. I opened drawers and closets, looking for evidence of the missing person's presence in my life. A few small items that might have belonged to them, though I couldn't be certain. The scarf, obviously, though I had no memory of how it had come to be among my possessions. A book with an inscription that could have been meant for me, though the handwriting seemed unfamiliar. The most unsettling discovery was a series of photographs I found in an old shoebox. They showed the missing person in various candid moments walking down the street, sitting in a cafe, entering their apartment building. The images had been taken from a distance with a telephoto lens, and the subject appeared unaware of being photographed. I stared at these pictures with growing horror. They were clearly surveillance photos, the kind taken by someone obsessively documenting another person's movements. But I had no memory of taking them, no recollection of owning the specialized camera equipment such images would require. Yet here they were, in my house, in my possession. The implications were inescapable, yet I couldn't reconcile them with my sense of myself. I wasn't the type of person who stalked others, who violated their privacy in such a fundamental way. But the evidence suggested otherwise, and evidence didn't lie the way memory could. I considered calling the investigators, turning over the photographs as proof of my involvement in whatever had happened. But something held me back, not guilt, exactly, but a growing uncertainty about my own reliability as a witness to my own life. If I couldn't remember taking these pictures, what else might I have forgotten? What other actions might I have committed and then somehow erased from my conscious mind? The house felt different now, contaminated by the possibility that I was not who I believed myself to be. Every familiar object might be evidence of behavior I couldn't recall. Every routine action might mask a pattern of obsession I was unable to acknowledge. I returned to the bathroom where this strange awakening had begun. The faucet still dripped, but now the rhythm seemed normal, each drop following its predecessor in logical sequence. The mirror reflected my face faithfully, though I still felt like I was looking at a stranger, someone capable of actions I couldn't imagine, someone whose true nature remained hidden even from themselves. The investigators would return, armed with more questions, more inconsistencies to explore. Other people would come forward with their observations and suspicions. The truth about what happened to the missing person would eventually emerge, constructed from witness statements and physical evidence and logical deduction. But I might never know my own role in that truth. The person who had lived through those events, who had made those choices and taken those actions, remained as missing to me as the person everyone was searching for. We had both vanished that night, leaving behind only traces and implications for others to interpret. I turned away from the mirror, but my reflection seemed to linger a moment longer than it should have, as if reluctant to abandon its post. In that delayed departure, I glimpsed something that might have been recognition, or guilt, or simply the acknowledgement that some mysteries resist solution, even when all the evidence points toward an inevitable conclusion. The water continued to drip, marking time in a house where time had become unreliable, where the past existed only in fragments and the present felt borrowed from someone else's life. I was still there, but somehow I remained missing too. Story 5. The weight of silence. The kitchen was filled with the gentle hum of the refrigerator, a dull companion to the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. Morning light slanted in through half-open blinds, casting stripes across the floor. The smell of toast lingered slightly in the air, mingling with the scent of fresh coffee. On the countertop, a lone spoon rested, stained but clean, as if waiting for its purpose. Yet a palpable disquiet infused the room. The back door stood ajar, nudging against the frame with each subtle breeze. It was as if the house was holding its breath, listening for footsteps that didn't come. I stood there for what felt like hours, though I knew it couldn't have been more than minutes. The silence pressed against my eardrums with an almost physical weight. My sister should have been here by now. She was never late for our weekly coffee ritual. never one to leave doors hanging open like loose thoughts. The spoon caught my attention again. Something about its placement seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. I picked it up, feeling the cool metal against my palm. The stain wasn't coffee or tea, it was something darker, more viscous. My fingers trembled slightly as I set it back down, exactly where I'd found it. That's when I noticed the notepad beside the telephone. Her handwriting, unmistakable in its careful loops and precise angles, covered half the page. Phone numbers, fragments of conversations, question marks scattered like breadcrumbs. One line stood out, he knows about the photographs. Below it, underlined twice, was a single word, midnight. The photographs, I hadn't thought about them in months, maybe longer. They were tucked away in her bedroom closet, sealed in an envelope she'd shown me once but never opened in my presence. Family pictures, she'd said, though something in her voice suggested otherwise. The way she'd held that envelope, like it contained either salvation or damnation, had always unsettled me. I called her phone. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. Her voice, bright and familiar, asked me to leave a message after the tone. But there was something different about the recording, a slight tremor I'd never noticed before, as if she'd been holding her breath while speaking. The house felt different now, charged with an energy I couldn't name. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound amplified. The refrigerator's hum grew louder, almost accusatory. I found myself moving through rooms I'd known since childhood, as if seeing them for the first time. In the living room, cushions were arranged too perfectly on the sofa. The coffee table bore no rings from glasses or magazines scattered carelessly. Everything was positioned with mathematical precision. This wasn't my sister's natural state. She lived in comfortable chaos, books stacked on every surface, shoes kicked off wherever convenience dictated. The photograph on the mantelpiece drew my attention. It showed the two of us from several summers ago, arms around each other's shoulders, genuine smiles lighting our faces. But someone had moved it. The frame now sat at an angle that caught the light differently, creating a glare that obscured our expressions. When I adjusted it back to its usual position, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked behind the frame. A phone number written in unfamiliar handwriting. Below it, in my sister's careful script, he called again. Same questions about the night she disappeared. The word hit me like cold water. My sister had never mentioned anyone disappearing, never spoken of mysterious phone calls or persistent questioners. Yet here was evidence of a conversation I'd never been part of, a story I'd never heard. I dialed the number with shaking fingers. It rang several times before a man's voice answered, cautious and measured. "I was wondering when you'd call," he said, as if he'd been expecting me specifically. "I found this number in my sister's house. She's missing." A pause stretched between us, filled with the weight of unspoken knowledge. "Missing," he repeated, and I could hear him choosing his words carefully. "That's an interesting choice of words. When did you last speak with her?" The question felt loaded, as if my answer would reveal more about me than about her whereabouts. I told him about our planned coffee meeting, about finding the house empty but not abandoned. "Did she ever mention the photographs to you?" he asked. My breath caught. What photographs? The ones from the hotel room, the ones that show what really happened that night. The line went dead. I stood there holding the silent phone, my mind racing through implications I couldn't quite grasp. Hotel room, what really happened? The fragments suggested a narrative I'd never been told, a story my sister had been carrying alone. The envelope in her closet called to me now with urgent necessity. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight like a countdown. Her bedroom door was closed, though I couldn't remember closing it during my initial search of the house. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. The bed was made with hospital corners, clothes hung in perfect alignment in the open closet, but the envelope was gone. In its place sat a small digital recorder, the kind journalists use for interviews. A yellow sticky note attached to its side bore a single word in my sister's handwriting: listen. I pressed play with trembling fingers. Her voice filled the room, but not as I'd ever heard it before. She spoke in whispers, as if afraid of being overheard. I should have told someone about this years ago, but I was scared, and then I was complicit, and now I don't know the difference anymore. Static interrupted her words, then cleared. She trusted me that night, said she needed somewhere safe to think, to decide what to do about what she'd discovered. I gave her the key to the hotel room, told her nobody would look for her there. I thought I was helping. A long pause filled with the sound of her breathing. When they found her the next morning, everything changed. The questions, the suspicions, the way people looked at me. But I knew something they didn't. I knew about the photographs she'd taken, the ones that proved what they were doing to those girls. My legs felt weak. I sat heavily on the bed, the recorder clutched in my hands. He's been calling me for weeks now, asking about that night, about what she might have told me. He knows I have the photographs. He knows I've been trying to decide whether to come forward. Another pause, longer this time. If something happens to me, if I disappear like she did, look for the safety deposit box. The key is taped under the kitchen sink, behind the pipe. Box number 473. Everything's there, the photographs, her diary, the letters she wrote but never sent. The recording ended. I sat in the gathering darkness, pieces of a puzzle I'd never known existed slowly arranging themselves in my mind. My sister hadn't just been keeping family photographs. She'd been protecting evidence of something much darker, something that had already cost one woman her life. The kitchen sink yielded its secret, easily, a small silver key attached to the pipe with electrical tape. My hands shook as I peeled it away, knowing that whatever I found in that safety deposit box would change everything. The bank felt like a tomb in the artificial light. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, led me to the vault without question. Box 473 was smaller than I'd expected, but when I lifted the lid, the contents took my breath away. Photographs, dozens of them, showing scenes I couldn't immediately process. Young women, barely more than girls, in various states of distress and undress. Men in expensive suits whose faces I recognized from newspaper business sections. Hotel rooms that looked like crime scenes. Beneath the photographs lay a diary bound in cracked leather. The handwriting inside belonged to neither my sister nor me, but to someone whose desperation bled through every carefully formed letter. They think because we're young, because we need the money, because we come from nowhere, that we don't matter. But I've been taking pictures, documenting everything. Someone needs to know what they're really doing to us. The entries detailed a network of exploitation that reached into the highest levels of local business and politics. Names I recognized, places I'd driven past countless times, all part of a system that treated human beings as commodities. The final entry was dated just days before the woman's death. I'm scared they know I've been taking pictures. He offered me money to disappear, to forget what I've seen. But how can I forget? How can I let them keep hurting other girls? I'm going to give everything to her. She works for the newspaper. She'll know what to do with it. Her, my sister. The woman had trusted my sister with evidence that could destroy powerful people, evidence that had ultimately gotten her killed. I understood now why my sister had been paralyzed by fear and responsibility. She'd been carrying the weight of another woman's courage, another woman's death for years. The phone calls, the questions, the pressure to hand over the photographs, it had been building toward this moment of disappearance. But where was she now? Had she finally decided to come forward, or had someone made that decision for her? The answer came in the form of a letter tucked beneath the diary, sealed but never sent. My name was written across the front in my sister's careful script. Inside, her words were both confession and goodbye. I should have been braver sooner. She died because I was too afraid to act on what she'd given me. Every day since then, I've been complicit in their crimes through my silence. But he's getting more insistent, more threatening. I think he knows I'm finally ready to talk. The letter went on to detail her plan, a meeting with a journalist from a newspaper in another state, someone far enough removed from local influence to tell the story properly. She'd arranged to hand over all the evidence, to finally honor the trust that had been placed in her. If you're reading this, it means something went wrong. The meeting was supposed to be safe, public, surrounded by witnesses, but I know now that these people have reach I never imagined. The final paragraph made my blood run cold. Don't trust anyone local with this information. Don't trust the police, don't trust the newspapers, don't trust anyone who might have connections to the men in those photographs. Take everything to the federal authorities or to journalists far from here. Make sure her death meant something. I sat in the sterile silence of the bank vault, surrounded by evidence of crimes that reached into every corner of my community. My sister was gone, disappeared like the woman whose courage had started this chain of events. But she'd left me with a choice: remain silent and complicit, or find the strength she'd finally discovered. The photographs felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the lives they represented and the deaths they'd caused. Somewhere out there, other young women were still at risk, still being exploited by men who believed their power made them untouchable. I thought about my sister's voice on that recording, filled with years of guilt and fear. I thought about the woman who died trying to expose the truth. I thought about the empty kitchen, the open door, the spoon stained with something darker than coffee. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. But as I prepared to leave the bank, evidence tucked securely in my bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The same feeling, perhaps, that had haunted my sister in her final weeks. The same feeling that had followed a young woman to her death in a hotel room years ago. The truth was finally going to come out, but would I survive long enough to tell it? The question followed me into the fading daylight, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, as I began the journey my sister had started and been unable to finish. Story 6. The recording static crept into my ears, a hiss that should have harmonized but faltered. The edges of the room seemed to pulse, shrinking and stretching with each breath I took. A book lay open on the table, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. Each word misaligned, letters jumbled as though read backwards and forwards at the same time. I traced my steps, unsure if they were mine or someone else's, a pattern almost familiar. The mirror on the wall held 2 reflections, but only one shifted when I moved. No, neither did. The nausea comes first, always. a weight in my stomach that spreads upward like oil through water, coating my throat with something bitter and metallic. I've been carrying this feeling for weeks now, maybe longer. Time has become elastic, stretching and compressing without warning. The sensation reminds me of swallowing coins as a child, that cold heaviness settling where it shouldn't belong. My hands shake as I reach for the recording device. The plastic feels warm, almost feverish against my palm. I press rewind, then play, then rewind again. The same conversation loops endlessly, but the words never quite align with what I remember saying. My voice sounds foreign, distorted by more than just the cheap microphone. There's something underneath it, a tremor that wasn't there before. The basement smelled like wet concrete and something else, something organic that had been left too long in darkness. I remember descending those stairs, each step echoing with a hollow sound that seemed to come from somewhere other than beneath my feet. The handrail was sticky with moisture that could have been condensation, but felt too warm, too viscous. But no, that's wrong. I was in the kitchen first. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting everything in that sickly green pallor that made my skin look corpse pale. The knife drawer hung open, its contents scattered across the counter in a pattern that should have been random but felt deliberately arranged. I counted them twice, then 3 times, but the number kept changing. The woman's eyes were the color of muddy water. She sat across from me at the small table, her fingers wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold hours ago. Steam no longer rose from its surface, yet she continued to blow on it, a reflexive gesture that made my skin crawl. Her lips moved constantly, forming words I couldn't quite hear over the static in my head. The static, always the static. I found myself watching her mouth, the way her tongue darted between her teeth when she paused mid-sentence. There was a small scar on her lower lip, a thin white line that caught the harsh kitchen light. I wondered how she got it, whether it hurt when she smiled. She wasn't smiling then, though. Her expression was something between fear and resignation, like a deer caught in headlights but too tired to run. The recording device sat between us on the table, its red light blinking like a heartbeat. I had placed it there, though I couldn't remember making the decision to do so. My finger hovered over the stop button, but I never pressed it. The conversation continued, meandering through topics that made no sense in sequence, whether her childhood dog, the price of milk, the way shadows moved differently in this house. This house, when did I start thinking of it as this house instead of my house? The walls felt unfamiliar, as if they had shifted during the night, rearranging themselves into a configuration that almost matched my memories, but not quite. The photographs on the mantel showed faces I recognized but couldn't name, smiling at moments I couldn't place. She mentioned the basement again, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Something about boxes that needed moving, about things that should have been thrown away long ago. I nodded, though I wasn't sure why. The basement had been empty when I moved in, hadn't it? Just concrete floors and exposed pipes, the detritus of previous owners long gone. But I remember the smell, wet concrete and decay and something else, something that made my nose burn and my eyes water. I remember the way my footsteps echoed differently down there, as if the space were larger than it appeared, stretching beyond the reach of the single bare bulb that swayed from the ceiling. The woman's coffee mug slipped from her fingers. I watched it fall in slow motion, the brown liquid arcing through the air like a question mark. It should have shattered on the linoleum, should have sent ceramic fragments skittering across the floor. Instead, it landed with a soft thud, intact but somehow wrong, as if the laws of physics had briefly forgotten how to apply themselves. She apologized, her voice cracking on the second syllable. I told her it was fine, though my own voice sounded like it was coming from underwater. Everything felt submerged, muffled by layers of something I couldn't identify. The air itself seemed thick, resistant to movement. I helped her clean up the spilled coffee, our hands brushing as we reached for the same paper towels. Her skin was cold, clammy with perspiration despite the warmth of the kitchen. She flinched at the contact, pulling away so quickly that she knocked over the salt shaker. White crystals scattered across the dark table like tiny bones. The recording device continued its faithful documentation, capturing every word, every pause, every breath. But when I played it back later, alone in the too-quiet house, the conversation sounded different. Gaps where I remembered words, words where I remembered silence. My voice asking questions I didn't remember asking, her voice providing answers that made no sense. She spoke about the previous tenant, the one who had left so suddenly. Personal belongings still in the closets, food rotting in the refrigerator as if they had simply vanished mid-thought. The landlord had been eager to rent the place, almost desperate. No security deposit, first month's rent half price, just sign the lease and move in immediately. I should have wondered why, should have asked more questions, but the price was right and I needed a place quickly. The house felt familiar somehow, as if I had dreamed about it long before I ever saw the listing. The key turned in the lock like it had been waiting for me. The basement door stood ajar when I first toured the place. The landlord quickly closed it, mumbling something about faulty wiring and insurance liability. But I caught a glimpse of the stairs descending into darkness, and something about that vertical drop made my stomach lurch with recognition. Now the woman sat across from me, speaking in circles about things that might have happened or might have been imagined. Her words created a web of half-truths and implications, each strand connecting to another until the pattern became too complex to follow. I found myself nodding at inappropriate moments, shaking my head when agreement would have made more sense. The kitchen window showed only darkness outside, though I couldn't remember the sun setting. The glass reflected our distorted images back at us, two figures leaning across a table like conspirators sharing secrets. But the reflections moved slightly out of sync with our actual movements, creating a disorienting double vision that made my head pound. She asked if I had heard the sounds at night. Footsteps in the basement, she said, scratching in the walls, voices that might have been the wind but formed words if you listened carefully enough. I told her old houses made noise, that settling foundations and temperature changes could create all sorts of audio illusions. But I had heard them too. The footsteps that followed no logical pattern, starting and stopping without reason. The scratching that seemed to move through the walls like something alive, something searching. The voices that whispered my name in tones I almost recognized. The recording device's battery indicator blinked red, warning of impending failure. How long had we been talking? The digital display showed numbers that couldn't be right. Hours compressed into minutes or minutes stretched into eternities. Time had become unreliable, another system failing in a house full of broken things. She leaned forward, her muddy eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made me want to look away. Her voice dropped even lower, forcing me to strain to hear her words. She spoke about the previous tenant again, but now the story was different. Not vanished, she said, never left at all. The basement, always back to the basement. I found myself standing without remembering the decision to rise. The chair scraped against the linoleum with a sound like fingernails on concrete. The woman remained seated, watching me with an expression I couldn't read. The recording device continued its patient documentation, red light pulsing like a warning. My feet carried me toward the basement door, though my conscious mind screamed warnings I couldn't quite articulate. The doorknob felt ice cold under my palm, so cold it almost burned. The hinges creaked as the door swung open, revealing the wooden stairs descending into absolute darkness. The smell hit me immediately, wet concrete and decay and something else, something that made my stomach clench and my throat close. But I descended anyway, each step taking me deeper into air that felt thick as water, heavy with moisture and secrets. The bare bulb hung motionless from the ceiling, though I couldn't remember pulling the chain to turn it on. Its weak light created more shadows than it dispelled, carving the basement into a geography of hidden corners and uncertain depths. The concrete floor felt soft under my feet, yielding slightly with each step like earth that had been recently disturbed. Behind me, the woman's voice continued, though I could no longer make out individual words. The sound filtered down the stairs like water through cracks, distorted and fragmented until it became just another layer of the house's constant whispers. I found the boxes in the far corner, stacked haphazardly against the foundation wall. They were unmarked, sealed with tape that had yellowed and begun to peel at the edges. My hands moved without conscious direction, peeling away the tape, lifting the cardboard flaps to reveal contents that should have surprised me but didn't. Photographs, hundreds of them, scattered loose in the box like fallen leaves. Images of the house from different angles, different times of day, different seasons. But in every photo, a figure stood at one of the windows. Always the same window, always the same silhouette, though the face was never clear enough to identify. The second box contained clothing, women's clothing, folded neatly but smelling of must and something more unpleasant. The fabric felt damp despite the dry air, as if it had absorbed moisture from some invisible source. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in a plastic bag that had fogged with condensation, I found a small recorder. Not unlike the one still running upstairs in the kitchen. My fingers trembled as I pressed the play button. The voice that emerged was familiar, though I couldn't immediately place it. A woman speaking in measured tones about the house, about the sounds at night, about the previous tenant who had never really left. The same conversation I had been having upstairs, the same words, the same pauses, the same inflections, but recorded weeks ago, maybe months. The timestamp on the device showed dates that predated my arrival in the house. I climbed the stairs on unsteady legs, the recorder clutched in my sweating palm. The kitchen felt different now, smaller somehow, as if the walls had moved inward during my absence. The woman still sat at the table, but her position had shifted. She faced the basement door now, her muddy eyes fixed on the opening as if she had been watching my return. The recording device on the table had stopped blinking. Its battery had finally died, cutting off our conversation mid-sentence. But the woman continued talking, her lips moving in perfect synchronization with the voice emerging from the device in my hand. The same words, the same story, the same web of implications and half-truths. I looked at the photographs scattered across the kitchen counter, though I couldn't remember removing them from the box. The same house, the same window, the same silhouette, but now I could see details that had been invisible in the basement's dim light. The figure in the window had my face. All of them, every photograph, spanning what looked like years of surveillance, showed my face staring out from a window of a house I had only recently moved into. The woman's voice continued its patient recitation, explaining about the previous tenant, about the sounds in the walls, about the things that should have been thrown away long ago. But her lips weren't moving anymore. The voice came from the recorder, from the walls, from the air itself. I understood then with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins that I was having the same conversation I had always been having. The same words, the same questions, the same inevitable progression toward the basement and the boxes and the photographs that showed a truth I couldn't accept. The mirror on the wall reflected nothing now, just an empty frame showing the wall behind me. But I could feel eyes watching from the glass, patient and familiar and infinitely sad. The recording loops endlessly, documenting conversations that happened and didn't happen, capturing voices that belonged to people who left and never left, preserving moments that repeat like a prayer or a confession or a warning that no one will ever hear. The static continues, harmonizing with itself in frequencies that shouldn't exist, creating music from the gaps between what was said and what was meant. And in that music, if you listen carefully enough, you can hear the sound of footsteps in the basement, scratching in the walls, voices whispering names that might be yours or might belong to someone who lived here before and after and always. The book on the table turns its own pages now, words rearranging themselves into stories that make sense only in the grammar of guilt and memory and time that moves in circles. I read them backwards and forwards, finding meaning in the spaces between letters, in the pauses between breaths, in the silence that follows every ending that isn't really an ending at all. Story 7. The morning air carried a crisp chill as I stepped onto the porch, where the scent of damp earth still lingered from last night's rain. A soft rustling of trees accompanied the distant hum of awakening life. As I reached for the newspaper, a subtle crunch echoed beneath my foot a neglected envelope, its paper sodden and ink smeared beyond recognition. Everything else appeared untouched, yet the envelope's unexpected presence whispered of something that should not be. The cool breeze ceased, leaving a tense stillness hanging in the air. I keep coming back to that sound, the crunch. It wasn't just paper giving way under weight. There was something else underneath, something that made my stomach twist before I even understood why. The envelope, I can see it now, or think I can. Waterlogged corners curling inward like fingers closing around a secret. The ink had run in streaks that looked almost deliberate, like someone had tried to erase words that were never meant to be erased. But that's not how it started, is it? No, it started with the smell, always the smell first. Damp earth, yes, but something else threading through it, something sweet and wrong, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I was reaching for something. The newspaper, I said, but newspapers don't arrive on porches anymore, do they? Haven't for years, so what was I really reaching for? My hand trembles when I try to remember the texture. Smooth paper, rough edges, something sticky between my fingers. The envelope wasn't the only thing there. There were others, had to be others. You should have left it alone. Whose voice is that? It comes from somewhere behind my left shoulder, but when I turn in my memory, there's only the door. The same door I came through, the same door that was supposed to be locked. The stillness wasn't natural, that much I know. Birds should have been singing, cars should have been starting up in driveways, children should have been walking to school, but there was nothing, just that terrible quiet that makes you want to hold your breath. I bent down, I remember bending down. My knees protested against the cold concrete, and when I touched the envelope, it felt warm. Not sun warm, body warm. The ink hadn't smeared from rain. That realization hits me now like it hit me then, a cold certainty that made my fingers recoil. Rain doesn't make ink run in perfect vertical lines. Rain doesn't leave fingerprints in the margins where someone tried to hold something steady while writing with shaking hands. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. The fragments don't line up the way they should. Time keeps folding back on itself, showing me pieces in the wrong order. There was a pattern in the way the envelopes were arranged, not scattered by wind or chance, placed, deliberately placed where someone would have to step on them to reach the door, where someone would have to hear that sound. That crunch. I can hear it now, sitting here trying to piece this together. It echoes in my ears like a warning I failed to heed, like a question I failed to ask. The first envelope wasn't empty, I know that now. Something shifted inside when I lifted it, something small and hard that rolled from one corner to the other, like a pill or a tooth. My hands shake when I think about opening it. Did I open it? The memory slips away every time I try to grasp it, like trying to hold water in cupped palms. Don't look inside, please don't look inside. That voice again, closer now, more desperate. It sounds familiar, but I can't place it. Can't see the face that goes with those words. The porch stretched longer than it should have. I remember that distinctly. 3 steps from the door to the edge, but somehow I was taking 5, 6, 7 steps and still hadn't reached the newspaper that may or may not have been there. The damp earth smell was stronger near the railing, fresher, like someone had been digging recently, like someone had been burying things that weren't meant to stay buried. I should have gone back inside then, should have locked the door and called someone. But who do you call when you can't explain what's wrong, when you can't even explain what you're seeing? The second envelope was underneath the first, cleaner, newer. The handwriting was different too, though I can't remember now what either looked like, just that they were different, like 2 people had been leaving messages, taking turns. Taking turns doing what? The sweetness in the air grew stronger when I moved toward the steps, cloying, overwhelming. It reminded me of something I'd smelled before, somewhere else, but the connection dances just out of reach. Funeral flowers, that's what it was. Funeral flowers left too long in a closed room. But there were no flowers on the porch, no flowers in the yard, nothing blooming anywhere I could see. You're remembering wrong. The voice is sharper now, more insistent. It wants me to stop digging, stop reconstructing, but I can't stop. The pieces are starting to fit together, even if the picture they're forming makes no sense. There was movement in the window across the street, a curtain falling back into place just as I looked up. Someone had been watching, waiting for me to find what they'd left. But when I try to picture that window, it's dark, empty, like the house behind it has been vacant for months. How long had the envelopes been there? The paper was sodden, yes, but not disintegrating, not moldy. Recent rain then, but the smell suggested something older, something that had been waiting much longer than one night. I lifted the second envelope. This one was heavier, fuller, and warm like the first, but with a different kind of warmth. Urgent warmth, desperate warmth. The ink on this one hadn't run at all. That should have been my first clue. Rain affects everything equally. If one envelope was damaged by water, they all should have been, unless they'd been placed at different times, unless someone had been coming back night after night, leaving new messages. New warnings. The address was written in block letters, careful and deliberate, my address. But the name above it wasn't quite right, close but not right, like someone had been guessing, like someone knew where I lived but not who I was. Or like someone knew exactly who I was but wanted me to think they didn't. Stop reading, put it down. That voice is mine, I realize that now. It's my own voice from that morning, trying to warn myself about something I couldn't yet understand. But I didn't listen then, and I can't stop now. The third envelope was tucked under the doormat. I almost missed it. Would have missed it if not for the corner poking out like a white tongue. This one was different again. older paper, yellowed edges, handwriting that looked almost antique. How long had someone been leaving these messages? How long had I been finding them and forgetting? Because I had forgotten, that's becoming clear now. This wasn't the first morning. Wasn't the first time I'd stepped onto the porch and heard that crunch under my feet. The memory of other mornings surfaces like bodies rising from deep water. Dozens of mornings, dozens of envelopes. Always the same routine, always the same confusion, always the same terrible certainty that something was wrong. But I never remembered the previous day, never connected the pattern, like someone had been reaching into my mind each night and carefully removing the evidence. The fourth envelope was inside the mailbox. I remember the cold metal of the handle, the way it squeaked when I opened it, the way my heart stopped when I saw what was waiting inside. Not just one envelope this time, dozens, packed tight like they'd been accumulating for weeks, for months. All addressed to me, all in different handwriting, all warm to the touch. You can't keep ignoring us. Not my voice this time, someone else. Someone standing right behind me, close enough that I should have felt their breath on my neck. But when I turned around, the porch was empty. The envelopes in the mailbox weren't random. They were organized, stacked in chronological order, oldest at the bottom. A careful record of something I couldn't remember participating in. The oldest ones were barely legible. Water damage, age, handling by too many fingers, but the newest ones were pristine, fresh, like they'd been placed there moments before I arrived. I started to count them, lost track somewhere around 30, started again, lost track again. The numbers kept changing like the pile was growing while I watched. Or shrinking. The smell was strongest near the mailbox, sweet decay mixed with something metallic, something that reminded me of pennies left too long in a pocket, of blood dried on concrete. But there was no blood, nothing visible. Just that smell and the growing certainty that I was standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, looking for answers to questions I'd forgotten how to ask. The sun should have been higher by now, should have burned off the morning chill and started the normal sounds of a waking neighborhood. But the light remained dim and gray, filtered through clouds that seemed too low, too heavy. Too deliberate. I opened the first envelope. The paper inside was blank. Completely blank. But when I held it up to the light, I could see impressions. Indentations where someone had pressed hard with a pen, writing on another sheet that had been placed on top. A message transmitted through pressure alone. The impressions formed letters, words, sentences that made my hands shake as I traced them with my finger. We know what you did. Simple, direct, terrifying in its certainty. But I hadn't done anything, had I? The gaps in my memory suddenly felt less like forgetfulness and more like deliberate editing. Like someone had been cutting pieces out of my life, removing evidence of actions I couldn't recall taking. The second envelope contained a photograph. I can't describe what was in that photograph, not because it was too disturbing, but because every time I try to focus on the details, they shift, change, rearrange themselves into something different. But I recognize the location, the angle, the lighting. It was taken from my bedroom window, looking down at the porch where I'm standing now, where I was standing then. Someone had been watching me find the envelopes, documenting my reactions, building a record of my confusion. But the timestamp on the photo was wrong. It showed a date I couldn't remember living through. A day that should have existed but felt completely foreign. How many days had I lost? How many mornings had I stood on this porch, finding messages, opening envelopes, discovering evidence of a life I couldn't remember living? The third envelope was different, heavier paper, more expensive, the kind used for formal invitations or legal documents. Inside was a single sentence, written in my own handwriting. I'm sorry for what I'm about to do. I don't remember writing those words, don't remember the pen that made those marks or the hand that guided it, but the handwriting is unmistakably mine. Every loop and curve matches the way I've signed my name for decades. The paper was dated, recent, so recent it should still be wet with ink. But I hadn't written anything recently, hadn't picked up a pen in days, maybe weeks. Unless those missing days were full of activities I couldn't access. Actions I'd taken while sleepwalking through a life I couldn't remember. You're starting to understand. That voice again, closer, more satisfied, like it had been waiting for this moment of recognition. I turned around slowly, expecting to see nothing, expecting the empty porch and the silent street. But something was different this time. The door behind me was open. I hadn't left it open. I never leave doors open. It's a habit born from years of living alone, years of checking locks and testing handles and making sure the barriers between inside and outside remain intact. But the door was open, and through it I could see into the hallway, into the shadows that seemed deeper than they should be in morning light. Something was moving in those shadows, something that had been waiting for me to find the right envelope, read the right message, ask the right questions. The remaining envelopes in my hands felt heavier now, more urgent, like they contained answers I needed but wasn't ready to find. The fourth envelope contained a key. Old brass, worn smooth by handling. It looked familiar, but I couldn't place it. Couldn't remember what lock it might open or why someone would want me to have it. But my fingers knew the shape, knew the weight. They closed around it like they'd held it before, many times, in circumstances I couldn't recall. The key was warm, not body warm like the envelopes. Warmer, like it had been sitting in direct sunlight or held against a source of heat. Or like it had been used recently, turned in a lock that had been waiting for it. The fifth envelope was addressed differently, not to me, but to someone else, someone whose name I recognized but couldn't place, like a word on the tip of my tongue that refuses to fall. Inside was a map, hand-drawn, crude but detailed. It showed streets I knew, landmarks I recognized, but arranged in a pattern that didn't match reality, like someone had taken a familiar place and twisted it into something new. Something wrong. There was a path marked on the map, a route that started from a point labeled here and wound through the distorted landscape to end at a spot marked with a simple X. The starting point was my house, my porch, the exact spot where I was standing. The ending point was somewhere I'd never been but somehow knew intimately. A place that existed in the gaps of my memory, in the spaces between the days I could remember and the ones that had been taken from me. Follow the map. The voice was coming from inside the house now, through the open door, from the shadows that were growing longer despite the morning light. I looked at the remaining envelopes in my hands, so many left to open, so many messages waiting to be decoded. But time was running out. The morning was stretching too long, becoming something unnatural. The light was fading instead of growing stronger, and the silence was becoming absolute. I had to choose, follow the map and leave the remaining envelopes unopened, or stay and read every message while whatever was waiting in the shadows grew more impatient. The key in my hand grew warmer, more insistent. The map showed a journey that would take me away from this place, away from the porch and the envelopes and the voice that knew more about my life than I did. But it would also take me toward answers, toward the truth about the missing days and the forgotten actions and the person I'd been when I wasn't being myself. I folded the map and put it in my pocket, left the remaining envelopes on the porch where someone else might find them, where they might serve as warnings or invitations or evidence of something that had already been set in motion. The key led me away from the house, down streets that looked familiar but felt foreign, past windows where curtains moved without wind and doors that stood open without invitation. The map was accurate despite its impossible geography. Every turn led exactly where it promised. Every landmark appeared exactly where it was drawn. But the journey felt longer than it should have. Like distance itself was stretching, making each step cover less ground than the last. The X on the map marked a place I'd been before, recently. The smell was the same sweet decay and metallic undertones. The light was the same gray and filtered and wrong. But now I could see what I'd been unable to see before, what the missing memories had been hiding. The envelopes weren't messages from someone else. They were messages from me, to me, left by the person I became during the hours I couldn't remember. Instructions and warnings and apologies for actions I'd taken while sleepwalking through a life that wasn't entirely my own. The key opened a door I'd locked myself, the door to a room I'd built but couldn't remember building. A room where I kept the evidence of everything I'd done and everything I'd forgotten and everything I was about to do again. The morning air still carries that crisp chill when I step onto the porch. The scent of damp earth still lingers from rain that may or may not have fallen. I still reach for something that might be a newspaper, and my foot still finds that envelope waiting beneath it. The crunch echoes the same way. The paper feels the same. The ink runs in the same impossible patterns. But now I know why the voice sounds familiar. Now I know who's been watching from the window. Now I know what I'm apologizing for in handwriting I don't remember making. The envelope crumples in my hand, and tomorrow there will be another. There will always be another, until I remember how to stop leaving them for myself to find. Until I remember how to stay awake during the hours when I become someone else. Until I remember what I keep forgetting I need to remember. The morning air carries that crisp chill, and somewhere in the distance, I can hear my own voice whispering warnings I'm already beginning to forget. Story 8. I stood motionless, eyes fixed on the seam where the wall met the floor. The carpet at the edge rippled unexpectedly, as if touched by invisible fingers. A distant creak echoed, a sound out of sync with the silent stillness that otherwise filled the space. My breath was shallow, cautious, synchronized with each elusive noise. The ceiling vent fluttered with a breeze that seemed to originate from nowhere. I hesitated to blink, fearing what might alter in that brief darkness behind my eyelids. The air shifted again, this time bringing with it the faintest scent of smoke, absent until now. I knew what had happened here. The police had closed the case months ago, and I'd accepted their conclusion without question. A simple break-in gone wrong. The homeowner had surprised the intruder, there had been a struggle, and someone had died. The physical evidence supported it perfectly. Broken window in the kitchen, overturned furniture, blood on the hardwood floor near the back door. The detective had walked me through it all with professional certainty, his voice steady as he pointed to each piece of evidence that told the story. The intruder had entered through the kitchen window sometime after midnight. Glass fragments scattered inward across the linoleum proved the break-in. Muddy footprints led from the window to the living room where I now stood. The homeowner must have heard something and come downstairs to investigate. That's when they encountered each other. I'd nodded along as the detective explained how the struggle had moved from room to room. A lamp knocked over here, a picture frame cracked there. The trail of destruction painted a clear picture of two people fighting for their lives. One of them hadn't made it out alive. The case was textbook, open and shut. I'd even helped provide some of the key evidence that sealed it. My testimony about what I'd witnessed that night had been crucial in establishing the timeline. Everything fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to be solved. But standing here now, months later, something felt different about this room. The air moved in ways that defied the closed windows. That scent of smoke lingered despite the fact that no one had lived here since the incident, and the carpet continued to ripple along that seam where the wall met the floor as if the house itself was breathing. I'd returned to walk through the scene one more time to put the whole thing to rest in my mind. Closure, I'd told myself, but instead of finding peace, I found myself noticing details that hadn't seemed important before. The way the afternoon light fell across the bloodstain on the floor created shadows that looked almost deliberate. The pattern of the overturned furniture seemed less random than I remembered. The detective had been so confident in his reconstruction of events. He'd stood exactly where I was standing now and pointed to the broken lamp, explaining how it had been knocked over during the struggle. But looking at it now, the lamp sat too far from where any logical fight would have taken place. The electrical cord was still plugged into the wall outlet, stretched taut across the walking path. If someone had knocked it over during a struggle, wouldn't the cord have been pulled from the wall? I moved closer to examine the lamp. The shade was dented, but the dent faced away from where the struggle supposedly occurred. The base showed scratches that looked more like deliberate scraping than accidental damage. These were details I should have noticed before, details that might have mattered. The muddy footprints the detective had shown me were still faintly visible on the hardwood. I followed their path from the kitchen to the living room, but they seemed to circle back on themselves in places. Some of the prints were deeper than others, as if whoever made them had been carrying something heavy at certain points but not others. That didn't match the story of a panicked intruder moving through an unfamiliar house. In the kitchen, I studied the broken window more carefully. The glass fragments were scattered inward, just as the detective had noted. But some of the pieces had landed under the kitchen table, in spots that would have been impossible to reach if the glass had simply fallen when the window was broken. Someone would have had to deliberately place them there, or sweep them under the table after the fact. The window frame itself showed tool marks around the latch. Fresh scratches in the paint suggested the window had been forced open, but the scratches were on the inside of the frame, not the outside where an intruder would have worked. I ran my finger along the marks, feeling their sharp edges. These weren't old scratches worn smooth by time and weather. My hands were trembling slightly as I examined the evidence. The certainty I'd felt about this case was beginning to crack like ice under spring sun. Each detail I re-examined seemed to tell a different story, than the one I'd accepted so readily before. I thought back to that night when I'd given my statement to the police. I'd been so sure about what I'd seen and heard. The timing had seemed clear in my memory, but now, trying to recall the exact sequence of events, I found gaps where there should have been certainty. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Or had I filled in the blanks with assumptions that fit the story everyone expected to hear? The detective had asked leading questions during my interview. He'd suggested time frames and scenarios, and I'd agreed because they seemed reasonable. But had I actually witnessed those specific details, or had I simply confirmed what he already believed had happened? The distinction felt crucial now, though it hadn't seemed important at the time. I walked back to the living room and stood in the exact spot where the homeowner had supposedly fallen. The bloodstain on the floor was darker than the surrounding wood, a permanent reminder of violence, but the shape of the stain bothered me now. It was too neat, too contained. If someone had fallen here during a struggle, wouldn't there be more scattered drops, more signs of movement? The smell of smoke was stronger near the bloodstain. I knelt down and inhaled carefully, trying to identify the source. It wasn't cigarette smoke or the scent of a fireplace. This was something else, something chemical and sharp that made my throat tighten. The house had been empty for months. Where could such a smell be coming from? I noticed a small burn mark in the hardwood near the edge of the stain. It was roughly circular, about the size of a quarter, and the wood around it was slightly discolored. This mark hadn't been mentioned in the police report. I was certain of that because I'd read the report multiple times, memorizing every detail. So either the investigators had missed it, or it had appeared after they'd finished processing the scene. The ceiling vent directly above continued to flutter, though I couldn't detect any air movement in the rest of the room. I dragged a chair over and climbed up to investigate. The vent cover was loose, held by only 2 of its 4 screws. When I lifted it aside, a stronger wave of that chemical smell wafted down. Inside the ductwork, barely visible in the dim light, was a small metal container. It was wedged between 2 joints in the ductwork, placed deliberately where it wouldn't be easily found. My heart rate increased as I reached for it, though I couldn't say why. Some instinct warned me that whatever was in this container would change everything I thought I knew about this case. The container was warm to the touch and made a soft sloshing sound when I moved it. There was no label, but a small valve on one side suggested it was designed to release whatever was inside. I climbed down from the chair and set the container on the coffee table, staring at it as if it might explain itself. This changed everything. The police investigation had been thorough, but they hadn't found this container, which meant either it had been placed here after they'd finished, or someone had hidden it well enough to escape detection. Either possibility suggested a level of premeditation that contradicted the random break-in theory. I thought about my own role in establishing that theory. My testimony had been key in convincing the investigators that the incident had occurred during a specific time frame. But what if I'd been wrong about the timing? What if what I'd witnessed wasn't the crime itself, but someone staging the scene to look like a crime? The possibility made my stomach turn. If I'd been mistaken about what I'd seen, then my testimony had helped convict an innocent person while the real perpetrator remained free. But if I'd been deliberately misled, then someone had used me as an unwitting accomplice in covering up the truth. I tried to remember exactly what I'd told the detective during my interview. I described hearing sounds from this house late at night. Shouting, followed by silence, then the sound of someone moving around inside. I'd assumed I was hearing the break-in and struggle. But what if those sounds had been someone cleaning up after a crime that had already occurred? What if the real violence had happened hours earlier in complete silence? The container on the coffee table seemed to pulse with menace. I knew I should call the police immediately and report finding it, but something held me back. A growing suspicion that calling the authorities might not lead to justice, but to more cover-up. If this container had been hidden here deliberately, whoever put it there might have connections that reached into the investigation itself. I thought about the detective who'd handled the case. He'd been friendly and professional, but also eager to close the case quickly. He'd seemed almost relieved when my testimony supported his theory about the break-in. At the time, I'd attributed his satisfaction to professional competence. Now I wondered if there had been other motivations. The chemical smell from the container was making me lightheaded. I moved away from it and opened a window, letting fresh air flow into the stagnant room. But even with the window open, that sense of unease continued to grow. I felt like I was being watched, though I knew the house was empty. Or was it I'd assumed I was alone here, but that assumption was based on the same kind of certainty that had led me astray about everything else. I listened carefully for any sounds that might indicate another presence. The house creaked and settled around me, but those were normal sounds for an old building, weren't they? I found myself questioning every sensation, every perception. The way shadows fell across the room looked different now, more deliberate and threatening. The temperature seemed to fluctuate without any obvious cause. Even my own memories felt unreliable, shifting and changing as I examined them more closely. What if I hadn't just witnessed the aftermath of a crime? What if I'd been present during the actual planning or execution? The timeline I'd given to police was based on my recollection of when I'd gone to bed and when I'd been awakened by sounds from this house. But memory is fallible, especially when trauma is involved. I might have been more involved in these events than I'd realized or admitted to myself. The bloodstain on the floor seemed to mock my confusion. Someone had died here, that much was certain. But who and why and at whose hand? The answers I'd accepted so readily now seemed like convenient fiction designed to hide a more complex and disturbing truth. I picked up the metal container again, feeling its weight and warmth. Whatever was inside had been placed here for a reason. Maybe it was evidence of the real crime. Maybe it was insurance against someone who knew too much. Or maybe it was bait, designed to lure someone like me into a trap I couldn't see until it was too late. The smart thing would be to leave immediately and never return, to accept the official story and stop asking questions that had no good answers, but I'd come too far to turn back now. The truth was somewhere in this room, hidden among the shadows and contradictions and carefully arranged evidence. I just wasn't sure I was ready to face what that truth might reveal about the case, about the investigation, and most troubling of all, about my own role in whatever had really happened here. The container grew warmer in my hands and the chemical smell grew stronger. Time was running out to make a decision about what to do next, but every choice seemed to lead deeper into a maze where the distinction between victim and perpetrator, between truth and deception, became increasingly impossible to determine. Story 9. It wasn't the first time the hallway felt unusually cold. The heater in our building had a tendency to work sporadically, and nobody seemed to mind anymore. The creaks above my head were familiar, almost comforting in their persistence, suggesting the restless pacing of someone above. I poured myself a cup of coffee, noticing the mug had a chip at its base that hadn't been there last week. Outside, cars moved by in their usual rhythm, unaffected by any uncertainties elsewhere. I glanced at the mail slot where an envelope sat unopened and thought briefly about the name on it. I folded the day's newspaper without reading past the headlines. As I left, I made sure the door was firmly shut behind me, but I didn't bother checking if it locked. The thing about quiet revelations is that they arrive without ceremony. You don't hear trumpets or feel the earth shift beneath your feet. Instead, you notice the way someone's keys sound different when they turn in the lock, or how their footsteps have developed a new hesitation at the top of the stairs. The envelope had been there for 3 days before I touched it, and even then, I only moved it to dust the surface beneath. I keep thinking about when the suspicion started, but memory has a way of reshaping itself. Was it the conversation I overheard through the thin walls, where voices dropped to whispers just as I approached? Or perhaps it was earlier, when I realized that the person upstairs had been walking the same pattern every night, 7 steps to the window, pause, then back again. The rhythm had become so predictable that I found myself counting along. The newspaper clipping I found wedged behind the radiator seemed insignificant at first. Just a small article about someone who had gone missing, the kind of story that appears and disappears without much notice. But the photograph troubled me. There was something familiar about the face, though I couldn't place where I might have seen it. The features were ordinary enough, the kind that could belong to anyone who lived in buildings like ours, who walked the same streets, who bought coffee from the same corner shops. I started paying attention to sounds differently after that. The building had its own language of settling and shifting, but now I began to distinguish between the normal complaints of old wood and something else. Someone was moving things around upstairs, not furniture exactly, but smaller objects. I could hear the soft scrape of items being repositioned, the gentle thud of boxes being set down and picked up again. The mug with the chip became important, though I'm not entirely sure why. I found myself examining it each morning, running my finger along the damaged edge. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. But once you knew it was there, it was impossible to ignore. Like a crack in a wall that seems to grow wider each time you glance at it, even though you know that's impossible. I began to reconstruct the timeline, trying to pinpoint when things had started to feel different. The envelope had arrived on a Tuesday, I was almost certain of that. But then I remembered it being there on the previous weekend, which would make it a Saturday. The more I thought about it, the less certain I became. Time has a way of folding in on itself when you're not paying attention, and I realized I hadn't been paying attention for quite some time. The person upstairs had a visitor once. I heard 2 sets of footsteps instead of one, and their voices carried through the ceiling in a way that suggested urgency. I pressed my ear to the wall, but the words were indistinct, like hearing a conversation underwater. What struck me was the quality of the silence that followed, not the comfortable quiet of people at ease, but the heavy stillness that comes after difficult truths have been spoken. I started leaving my apartment at different times, taking routes that would let me see who came and went from the building. It wasn't deliberate surveillance, I told myself, just curiosity about my neighbors. But I found myself noting details, the color of coats, the sound of different footsteps on the stairs, the way people held their keys. Everyone had their patterns, their small rituals of coming and going. The newspaper clipping bothered me more as days passed. I had placed it on my kitchen table, smoothing out the creases, studying the grainy photograph. The article mentioned a job at a local business, a routine that involved early mornings and late evenings. It described someone who kept to themselves but was generally well regarded by those who knew them. The kind of person who might live in a building like ours, who might walk quietly up and down the same hallway. I realized I had never actually seen the person who lived upstairs. In all the months I had been listening to their movements, noting their patterns, I had never encountered them face to face. This seemed impossible in a building so small, with only one staircase and a narrow hallway. Yet I couldn't recall a single interaction, not even a brief nod of acknowledgement. The envelope finally demanded my attention when I noticed it had been moved. Not opened, but shifted from its original position by the mail slot. Someone had picked it up, examined it, then placed it back down at a slightly different angle. The name on the front was written in careful block letters, the kind of handwriting that suggests deliberation rather than haste. I began to wonder if the person upstairs was wondering about me too, whether they had noticed my own patterns, the way I paused at certain spots in the hallway, the timing of my comings and goings. The building was small enough that we were all intimate strangers, sharing walls and ceilings, breathing the same recycled air, yet maintaining the fiction of privacy. The sounds from above changed again. Instead of the regular pacing, there were longer periods of stillness punctuated by sudden bursts of activity. I heard what sounded like drawers being opened and closed, papers being shuffled, the soft thump of books or boxes being stacked. It had the quality of someone organizing or perhaps packing. I found myself checking the newspaper more carefully, looking for follow-up articles about the missing person. But stories like that tend to disappear quickly unless there are dramatic developments. People vanish from the news as easily as they vanish from life, leaving behind only small mysteries that no one has time to solve. The mug developed a second chip, this one along the rim. I was certain I hadn't dropped it or knocked it against anything, yet there it was, another small flaw that seemed to have appeared overnight. I began to question my memory, wondering what other details I might have missed or misremembered. The building felt less solid somehow, as if the walls were shifting when I wasn't looking. I started leaving my door unlocked deliberately, though I'm not sure what I was hoping would happen. Perhaps I wanted to test whether someone was paying as much attention to my habits as I was to theirs. The unlocked door felt like an invitation or a challenge, though I couldn't say which. The envelope disappeared on a Thursday, or maybe it was a Friday. I noticed its absence the way you notice when a familiar sound stops, suddenly aware of something that had become part of the background. The space where it had been looked oddly empty, as if the envelope had left an impression on the surface beneath it. I realized that I had been constructing a story without enough information, filling in gaps with assumptions and possibilities. The newspaper clipping, the sounds from upstairs, the moved envelope, none of these things necessarily connected to each other. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of something larger, a pattern that would make sense if only I could see it from the right angle. The person upstairs stopped pacing entirely for several days. The silence was more unsettling than the footsteps had been. I found myself listening intently for any sign of movement, any indication that someone was still there. The building felt hollow without those familiar sounds, as if an essential rhythm had been disrupted. When the footsteps resumed, they were different, lighter somehow, or perhaps more cautious. The pattern had changed to no longer the regular back and forth to the window, but random movements that suggested someone searching for something, or perhaps avoiding something. I began to suspect that my own behavior had become part of someone else's mystery. The way I lingered in the hallway, the questions I had asked the building manager about previous tenants, my sudden interest in checking the mail more frequently. Perhaps I had become as puzzling to others as they had become to me. The newspaper clipping vanished from my kitchen table, though I was certain I had left it there. I searched through papers and magazines, thinking it might have gotten mixed in with something else, but it was simply gone. Its absence felt significant, though I couldn't articulate why. I started to wonder if the missing person in the article had ever really existed, or if I had somehow imagined the whole thing. Memory is unreliable, especially when you're not sure what you're trying to remember. The photograph that had seemed so familiar now felt like something I might have dreamed. The building manager mentioned that the apartment upstairs would be available soon. He said it casually, as if it were common knowledge, but I had heard no sounds of moving, no indication that anyone was preparing to leave. When I asked when the current tenant would be gone, he looked at me strangely and said he thought I would know. I climbed the stairs that evening, something I had never done before. The hallway above was identical to mine, but reversed a mirror image that felt both familiar and foreign. I stood outside the door that would be directly above my apartment, listening for any sound from within. The silence was complete. The door was slightly ajar, though I was certain it had been closed when I first approached. I pushed it open gently, expecting resistance or the sound of hinges, but it moved without noise. The apartment was empty, not just of people, but of everything. No furniture, no personal belongings, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing in the vacant space. The windows were clean, the floors swept, the walls unmarked. It was as if the apartment had been waiting, patient and ready for whatever would come next. I tried to reconcile this emptiness with the sounds I had been hearing, the patterns I had memorized, the presence I had felt so strongly above my head. Standing at the window where I had imagined someone pacing every night, I looked down at the street below. Cars moved in their usual rhythm, people walked by without looking up. Life continued its ordinary course. From this angle, everything looked different, smaller and more distant, as if I were observing from a great height rather than just one floor up. I left the empty apartment and returned to my own, where everything was exactly as I had left it. The chipped mug sat on the counter, the folded newspaper lay unread, the space where the envelope had been remained empty. But something had shifted, some fundamental assumption about the nature of what I had been experiencing. The sounds above my head continued that night, the familiar pattern of 7 steps to the window and back again. I lay in bed listening, trying to understand how empty rooms could generate such purposeful movement. The footsteps seemed more deliberate now, as if whoever was making them knew they were being heard and wanted to be heard. I began to consider the possibility that I had been wrong about everything, about the timeline, about the sounds, about the envelope and the newspaper clipping. Perhaps the mystery was not about someone else at all, but about the way attention can create significance where none exists, how the mind can construct elaborate explanations for simple coincidences. Yet the mug developed a third chip, this one so small it was barely visible unless you held it up to the light. I found myself doing this regularly now, examining the accumulating damage, wondering if I was somehow causing it without realizing it. The ceramic seemed to be deteriorating in slow motion, each flaw appearing overnight like a secret message I couldn't decode. The building felt different now that I knew the upstairs apartment was empty. The sounds I heard might have been coming from anywhere, the walls settling, pipes expanding and contracting, the normal complaints of an old structure, but they maintained their pattern, their suggestion of human presence and purpose. I started leaving my door unlocked again, not as a test this time, but as an acknowledgement. If someone was moving through the building at night, creating the sounds I attributed to the empty apartment above, then perhaps they needed access to spaces that were usually closed to them. The unlocked door felt like a small act of cooperation with forces I didn't understand. The envelope reappeared one morning, back in its original position by the mail slot. The same careful block letters, the same unfamiliar name, but somehow different now, as if it had been somewhere and returned with new information. I didn't touch it this time, just noted its presence and continued with my routine. I realized that I had become part of the pattern I had been trying to solve. My own movements through the building, my attention to details that might have been meaningless, my reconstruction of events that might never have happened. Someone else might be listening to my footsteps now, wondering about my intentions, constructing their own theory about what I was doing and why. The newspaper clipping appeared on my kitchen table again, though I was certain I had searched everywhere for it. The photograph seemed less familiar now, the features more generic, the story more ordinary. Perhaps I had been seeing connections that existed only in my need to find them, patterns that were really just the random intersection of unrelated events. Standing in my hallway this morning, I noticed how cold it felt despite the heater's persistent efforts. The familiar creaks from above suggested someone pacing restlessly, though I now knew those rooms were empty. I poured coffee into the mug with its accumulating chips, each small flaw a marker of time passing in ways I couldn't track. The envelope sits by the mail slot, patient and unopened, waiting for whatever resolution these small mysteries might eventually find. Outside, cars continue their usual rhythm, unaffected by the uncertainties that have taken root in this building. I fold the newspaper without reading it, leaving the door carefully unlocked behind me, and wonder if the person I've been trying to understand is simply another version of myself, trapped in the same cycle of attention and doubt. The hallway feels unusually cold again, just as it did when this all began, though I'm no longer certain when that was or what it means that it continues. Story 10. I stood silently in the dim room, watching the curtains flutter even though no breeze should have been present. The air seemed to thicken around me, weighted by an unseen tension that prickled my skin. The walls groaned softly, as if stretching after an eternity of stillness, yet no movement caught my eye. My pulse quickened as the seconds drew out, each heartbeat echoing louder in my ears. Then from the corner of my sight, I noticed a picture frame tilted ever so slightly, an angle that hadn't existed mere moments before. The photograph inside showed 3 people standing beside a lake, their faces weathered by sunlight and smiles that seemed genuine enough. But something about their positioning felt wrong, as if they'd been arranged by someone who didn't quite understand how people naturally stood together. The woman in the center had her hand resting on the shoulder of the man to her left, yet her eyes looked toward the third figure, a younger man whose expression carried a weight that didn't match the other's apparent joy. I'd been staying in this house for what felt like weeks, though the days had begun blending together in ways that made counting impossible. The owner had left suddenly, or so the neighbors claimed when I'd asked about the overgrown garden and the newspapers piling up by the front door. They'd given me conflicting stories about where she'd gone and when she might return. One insisted she'd mentioned visiting family across the country. Another swore she'd never spoken of having any relatives at all. The house key had been exactly where they'd said it would be, tucked beneath a loose brick near the back entrance. The neighbors had been helpful in that regard, eager to have someone keeping an eye on the place. Too eager, perhaps. Their relief when I'd offered to house sit had seemed disproportionate to the simple favor I was providing. Walking through the rooms had become a ritual of sorts. Each morning I'd start in the kitchen, noting which cabinet doors had somehow shifted during the night, which dishes had moved from where I'd left them. The coffee maker bore scorch marks that hadn't been there initially, or maybe I simply hadn't noticed them before. Memory had a way of reshaping itself in this place, making me question what I'd actually observed versus what I thought I remembered seeing. The living room held the most contradictions, books arranged by height on some shelves, by color on others, with no apparent system governing the choices. A chess set positioned mid-game, though the moves made no strategic sense when I studied them closely. Someone had been playing, but not someone who understood the rules, or perhaps someone who'd invented rules of their own. Upstairs, the bedroom closets told different stories. One held clothes in multiple sizes, suggesting either significant weight fluctuations or multiple occupants. Another contained only empty hangers, their metal hooks catching what little light filtered through the heavy drapes. The bathroom medicine cabinet revealed prescription bottles with labels that had been carefully scraped away, leaving only ghost impressions of words I couldn't quite decipher. The basement drew me despite my growing unease. Stone walls sweated with moisture that had no clear source, and the air carried scents that shifted depending on where I stood. Sometimes it smelled of old wood and dust, familiar and almost comforting. Other times, sharper odors emerged, chemical and medicinal, making my throat tighten involuntarily. Boxes lined the walls down there, their contents a mixture of ordinary household items and things that raised questions I couldn't formulate properly. Children's toys mixed with adult clothing. Holiday decorations for celebrations that didn't align with any calendar I recognized. Photographs bundled with rubber bands, showing the same three people from the tilted frame upstairs, but in these images their relationships seemed different somehow, their body language suggesting tensions or intimacies that contradicted the late photograph's casual friendliness. The phone rang occasionally, always at odd hours when I was least prepared to answer. The voice on the other end would ask for someone whose name I didn't recognize, then pause when I explained I was just watching the house. The caller would thank me politely and hang up, but something in their tone suggested they knew more about my situation than they were revealing. These conversations left me staring at the receiver long after the dial tone resumed, wondering who they'd really been trying to reach. Mail continued arriving despite the owner's absence. Bills addressed to different names, some matching the scraped prescription labels, others completely unfamiliar. Credit card offers for people who might or might not exist. A postcard with no return address, showing a lighthouse against stormy skies, with a message written in handwriting that seemed to change styles mid-sentence. The water remembers everything we've forgotten. Sleep became elusive as the house's rhythms grew more pronounced. Footsteps crossed the floor above my head during hours when I knew I was alone. Water ran through pipes when no faucets were open. The refrigerator hummed melodies that almost sounded like songs I'd heard before, but distorted enough to remain unidentifiable. I began keeping a journal, thinking documentation might help me distinguish between actual events and the anxiety-induced paranoia that seemed to be clouding my perceptions. But when I read my entries the following day, they often described incidents I couldn't recall writing about. My handwriting appeared consistent, yet the voice behind the words felt foreign, as if someone else had been borrowing my thoughts and expressing them in ways I wouldn't have chosen. The neighbors' visits became more frequent, their questions more probing. They wanted to know if I'd heard from the owner, if I'd found anything unusual, if I felt comfortable staying alone in such a large house. Their concerns seemed genuine, but their eyes held a watchfulness that made me wonder what they expected me to discover. When I mentioned the phone calls, they exchanged glances that lasted a fraction too long before assuring me that wrong numbers were common in the area. One morning I found the basement door open, though I distinctly remembered checking the lock the previous evening. The boxes had been rearranged, not dramatically, but enough to suggest someone had been searching through them. Or perhaps I'd done the searching myself and forgotten, the way I'd apparently forgotten writing several journal entries that detailed my growing suspicions about the neighbors' true motives. The tilted picture frame had become my anchor point, the one constant in a house where everything else seemed subject to subtle but persistent changes. I'd straightened it repeatedly, only to find it askew again within hours. The three people in the photograph began to feel like old acquaintances, their faces familiar from repeated viewing, their story something I was slowly piecing together from fragments scattered throughout the house. The woman's clothing appeared in multiple closets upstairs. The older man's reading glasses sat on the kitchen counter, prescription lenses that turned the world into a blur of shapes and colors when I tried them on. The younger man's presence was harder to pin down, existing mainly in the spaces between things, in the arrangements that suggested a third person's preferences or habits. I started timing the house's sounds, mapping their patterns against my daily routines. The footsteps overhead occurred most frequently when I was in the basement, as if someone was monitoring my exploration of the boxes and their contradictory contents. The water sounds coincided with my attempts to sleep, creating a rhythm that was almost soothing, until I remembered that no one should be using the plumbing. The phone calls intensified, coming at more frequent intervals and lasting longer before the mysterious caller would hang up. Sometimes I could hear breathing, occasionally what sounded like muffled conversation happening in the background. Once I distinctly heard my own voice speaking words I wasn't saying, as if the call was somehow picking up an echo from another conversation entirely. My journal entries grew more detailed and simultaneously less reliable. I wrote about conversations with people I couldn't remember meeting, about discoveries in rooms I was certain I'd never entered. The handwriting remained mine, but the perspective felt increasingly foreign, as if I was reading someone else's interpretation of my experiences. The neighbors began avoiding eye contact when we passed on the street. Their friendly concern had been replaced by something more cautious, more evaluative. I caught them watching the house from their windows, noting my comings and goings with an attention that felt more like surveillance than neighborly interest. In the basement, I found a box I'd somehow missed during previous searches. Inside were documents that should have answered my questions, but instead deepened the mystery. Property deeds with conflicting ownership information. Insurance policies covering people who shared names with the prescription bottles, but whose described relationships made no logical sense. A marriage certificate between the woman and the older man, dated on the same day as a death certificate for someone with the younger man's physical description. The tilted picture frame had become my obsession. I'd measured its angle, photographed its position, even placed small objects nearby to detect any movement, yet it continued shifting, always returning to that same precise tilt that had first caught my attention. The three people in the photograph seemed to be watching me now, their expressions subtly different each time I looked, as if they were reacting to my investigation of their lives. Standing in that dim room again, watching the curtains flutter in the absent breeze, I realized that the house wasn't hiding its secrets from me. It was revealing them slowly, forcing me to confront possibilities I'd been avoiding. The neighbors' nervousness, the phone calls, the rearranged boxes, the contradictory documents, they all pointed toward a truth that was simpler and more disturbing than I'd wanted to acknowledge. The picture frame tilted again as I watched, moving with the same subtle certainty it had displayed from the beginning. But this time I understood what I was seeing. The three people in the photograph weren't strangers whose story I was uncovering. They were people I'd known, people whose absence I'd been trying to understand by creating elaborate mysteries around their disappearance. The house hadn't been abandoned by its owner. The owner had never left at all. The neighbors weren't watching me with suspicion because they were hiding something. They were watching me because they were worried about what I might do next, what I might remember, what I might finally admit to myself about why I was really here, and what had happened to the three people whose belongings I'd been cataloging with such careful, guilty attention.